Hi guys, and welcome to History for Calm Nights. Tonight we step quietly into the grey chill of an 18th century European morning where your breath hangs in the air like a faint ghost, and the world feels slower, heavier, and far less forgiving than your centrally heated bedroom. You wake not to an alarm on your phone, but to the dull creak of timber and the distant shuffle of someone else already stirring. The mattress beneath you is stuffed with straw that rustles every time you shift. It smells faintly of dust and last summer's harvest. You pull the blanket closer and immediately realise that if you had been born into this life, you probably would not survive this without a great deal of complaining. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, tell me where you are listening from and what your local time is. I always love seeing how many different corners of the modern world gather here together. Now dim the lights and let yourself drift into the pale, reluctant dawn of 18th century Europe. You open your eyes to a ceiling crossed with dark wooden beams. There is no glass window sealed tight against the weather. Instead, a small opening admits a reluctant thread of light and unfortunately a steady draft. A broadly accepted historical reality is that most ordinary homes across Europe at this time were poorly insulated by modern standards. Even in towns built of stone gaps and construction allowed wind to creep in. In rural cottages of timber and wattle, the cold had a talent for slipping through every seam. You sit up slowly. The room is not truly a bedroom in the way you understand it. It is a shared sleeping space, perhaps a loft above the main living area, perhaps simply one corner of a single multipurpose room. The faint scent of ash lingers from last night's fire. You can hear someone below you, maybe your mother or your spouse, coaxing embers back to life with a soft breath and the gentle clink of iron tools. The fire is not a decorative feature. It is survival. You swing your feet onto the floor. The boards are cool, almost damp with morning chill. There is no plush rug waiting to cushion you. Instead, you feel every splinter and groove beneath your soles. You dress quickly because lingering in your shift or shirt is a luxury the temperature does not allow. Linen clings to your skin slightly rough, then wool layered on top. The fabric scratches faintly at your wrists and neck. You accept it. Comfort is relative here. In many regions, the day begins before sunrise, especially in agricultural communities. This is not a romantic choice. It is dictated by daylight and necessity. Without electric lamps, you rely on the sun to define your productivity. Candles exist, certainly, but they are not burned casually. They cost money. Even tallow candles made from animal fat represent resources that cannot be wasted. You might save them for tasks that truly require light after dark. As you descend the narrow ladder or staircase, you notice how close everything feels. Your family shares this space. Beds are often communal. A somewhat surprising detail that historians have uncovered from court records and diaries is that it was not unusual for unrelated individuals to share beds while travelling or lodging in inns. Privacy in the way you understand it is still a distant concept for many. You step into the main room. The fire now crackles faintly. The smell of smoke mixes with something earthy, perhaps yesterday's cabbage stew reheated for breakfast. It is not glamorous, but it is warm. You hold your hands towards the flames, feeling the first gentle return of sensation to your fingers. Water waits in a bucket near the door. It was drawn from a well the day before. It is cold enough to make you hesitate. You splash a little onto your face. There is no scented cleanser, no plush towel. You wipe your skin with a coarse cloth. Cleanliness exists, of course, but the standards differ. While people of this era did change linens and value tidiness, regular full immersion, bathing was less common in many regions than you might expect. Fuel to heat large quantities of water was precious, and bathing customs varied widely depending on location and class. You glance around at your surroundings. The furniture is sturdy but simple. A wooden table, a few stools, perhaps a chest for storing clothing and precious items. Everything has a function. Nothing is purely decorative. Even the walls may serve double duty with herbs hung to dry, or tools carefully arranged. Outside the village begins to stir. You hear a rooster crow not once but repeatedly, as if determined to personally guarantee the sunrise. A cartwheel grinds against stone somewhere down the lane. There is a faint murmur of voices, neighbours greeting one another or calling instructions. The air carries the scent of damp earth and animal life. If you live in a town, the sounds are sharper. Horses clatter over cobbles, vendors shout. Somewhere a church bell marks the hour. It's widely documented that church bells structured daily life in much of 18th century Europe. They signalled not only worship but time itself. Before widespread personal clocks, the community relied on these public cues. You listen for it, now that steady ringing grounding you in the shared rhythm of the settlement. You pause at the threshold, hand on the rough wood of the door. The day ahead stretches long. You know that work awaits, whether in fields, workshops, kitchens, or markets. There is no concept of a weekend in the modern sense. Rest days revolve largely around religious observance, and even then small tasks never fully disappear. Scholars still debate whether people of this era felt their hardships as acutely as you imagine, or whether, having known nothing else, they experienced their lives with a different internal scale of expectation. It is tempting to assume constant misery, yet letters and diaries reveal humour, affection, and moments of contentment. You might complain about the cold, yes. You might sigh at the monotony of porridge, but you also share laughter stories and a sense of belonging. You step outside at last. The sky is a pale wash of silver and faint pink. Dew clings to grass or mud soaking into your worn shoes. The chill nips at your cheeks. You inhale deeply. The air is clean in the countryside, tinged with manure and wood smoke. In a city, it may carry the sharper scent of refuse and industry. This is how your day begins. Not with scrolling through notifications, not with a steaming latte, but with the quiet acceptance that endurance is woven into every ordinary hour. You adjust your shawl or a coat, brace yourself against the wind, and move forward. And as you take those first steps into the morning, you begin to understand that daily life in 18th century Europe is not defined by grand events alone. It is defined by this moment, by cold floors, by shared spaces, by the steady pulse of necessity, by waking up again and again and meeting the day because there is simply no other choice. The light grows stronger. The village hum deepens. You join it, another figure in wool and linen, another pair of hands ready to work. The story of endurance is not dramatic yet. It is quiet. It starts here in the half-light, with you standing in the doorway, feeling the weight and the wonder of simply being alive in a world that demands resilience from dawn onward. You close the door behind you and the wood thuds softly into place, sealing in what little warmth the hearth has managed to gather. The morning is fully awake now, and as you walk a few steps from your own threshold, you begin to notice the homes around you with fresh attention. They stand shoulder to shoulder in town or scattered with cautious distance in the countryside, each one a quiet declaration of survival. If you live in a rural village, your cottage is likely built of timber-packed earth and wattle woven like a rough basket beneath a coating of plaster. The roof may be thatched, layered thickly with straw or reeds. It smells faintly sweet when dry and sharply organic when damp. A well-established historical understanding tells us that thatch was common across large parts of northern Europe because it was affordable and insulating, though it required regular maintenance to prevent leaks and fire. You glance upward and cannot help but notice how close your ceiling feels to your head. Smoke from the hearth often curls upward and lingers before escaping through a simple vent or hole, staining the beams dark with soot over years. Inside space is precious. In many modest homes, one large room performs the work of kitchen, living area, and sleeping quarters. You cook here, eat here, mend clothing here, and at night you unroll bedding or climb to a loft above. The air is thick with the memory of everything that has happened within these walls. Stew, sweat, damp wall smoke. It is not unpleasant exactly, but it is never neutral. If you imagine yourself in a growing city, perhaps London, Paris, or Vienna, the buildings rise taller and narrower. Stone replaces timber in many districts, brick lines the streets and upper floors, lean slightly forward as if eavesdropping on the road below. A mainstream historical fact worth noting is that by the 18th century, cities such as London had experienced repeated rebuilding after devastating fires leading to stricter use of brick and stone in many neighbourhoods. The structures look sturdier, but they are hardly spacious for the poor who crowd into them. You push open a neighbour's door in your mind and step inside. The floor might be hard-packed earth or uneven planks. There is a table scarred by years of chopping and kneading. A chest sits against the wall, holding the family's most valuable possessions. Perhaps a spare set of linen, a small stash of coins, a carefully folded document. Windows are small. Glass exists certainly, but it is expensive, and in poorer homes oiled paper or wooden shutters stand in for clear panes. You run your fingers along the interior wall. It feels cool and slightly gritty. In winter, this surface radiates cold back into the room. In summer, it traps heat. The hearth dominates everything. Without it, the house is simply a shell. With it, there is light, warmth, and a place to gather. Yet it also means constant smoke, constant ash. You learn to live with a faint sting in your eyes. A curious tidbit that often surprises modern listeners is that in some regions, people shared their living space with animals. During colder months, a cow or goat might be sheltered in an adjoining area, sometimes separated only by a low partition. The warmth they produced was practical. You may wrinkle your nose at the thought, but in the biting cold of a northern winter practicality outranks preference. Furniture is minimal. Chairs are not always plentiful. You might sit on a bench or a stool. Beds, when they exist as permanent structures, are treasured pieces. A bed with a wooden frame ropes woven tight to support a mattress and layered blankets represents real investment. In poorer households, pallets of straw laid directly on the floor are common. You shake one out, occasionally replacing the filling when it grows too compressed or infested. Comfort is always in negotiation. Historians still argue whether the average home felt overwhelmingly cramped to its inhabitants, or whether shared space fostered a sense of intimacy and collective resilience. Diaries from wealthier individuals sometimes complain about noise and proximity, yet folk songs and oral traditions speak of evenings around the hearth as times of storytelling and connection. You stand in the doorway and wonder which perspective feels truer to you. Outside, the street or lane forms an extension of the home. In villages, neighbours pass freely, exchanging news as they draw water or tend animals. In cities, the boundary between private and public blurs even more. Waste may be thrown into the street. Chamber pots emptied with a shouted warning. The ground underfoot is rarely clean. Mud mixes with refuse, and after rain the smell intensifies. You lift the hem of your garment slightly to keep it from dragging. Yet even here there is order of a kind. Homes cluster by trade. Bakers near bakers, weavers near weavers. The scent of yeast drifts from one doorway, sharp and comforting. From another, the metallic tang of a blacksmith's forge. You learn to navigate by smell as much as sight. If you belong to the wealthier ranks, your home expands in proportion to your status. Multiple rooms separate chambers, perhaps even decorative plasterwork and tapestries. Floors covered in rugs, windows glazed fully, a separate kitchen to contain smoke. A mainstream reality of the period is that social hierarchy is visible in architecture. Grand townhouses and rural estates display wealth not only through size, but through symmetry and ornamentation inspired by classical ideals. Still, even in grand homes, comfort remains relative. Drafts creep under doors, chimneys smoke unpredictably, lighting relies on candles and oil lamps that flicker and sputter. Night transforms every house into a softer shadowed version of itself. You pause again, imagining the weight of these walls around you. They are not simply shelter, they are labour made visible. Every beam cut by hand, every brick fired in a kiln, every thatch layered with aching arms, you sense the effort embedded in each surface. As the morning grows brighter, you step from one doorway back into the lane. The homes behind you stand steady, imperfect guardians against wind and rain. They are small worlds, each containing laughter, arguments, whispered prayers, and the ordinary routines that shape a lifetime. You walk onward, aware now that architecture is not just background. It is an active participant in endurance. The low ceiling forces you to stoop. The narrow staircase demands caution. The hearth draws you in each evening. Within these timber and stone boundaries, daily life unfolds, pressing close around you, shaping how you sleep, eat, and breathe. And as you continue down the street, the texture of these homes lingers in your fingertips, reminding you that survival in this century begins with walls that barely hold back the weather, and roofs that promise protection so long as you are willing to maintain them with steady, patient care. The doorways and walls fade behind you as you turn your attention to yourself, because before you can work, trade, or even sit comfortably by that smoky hearth, you must dress properly for the day. Clothing in 18th century Europe is not a quick decision made in front of a mirror. It is a layered ritual, one that shapes how you move, breathe, and endure the hours ahead. You begin with linen. A simple shift or shirt, pale and slightly coarse, rests against your skin. Linen is valued because it can be washed more frequently than outer garments, absorbing sweat and protecting the more expensive wool above. A widely recognized historical fact is that undergarments were central to hygiene at the time, even when full-body bathing was infrequent. Changing and laundering linen helped manage odor and dirt in a world without modern detergents. You pull the fabric over your head or fasten it at the neck. It feels cool at first, then warms quickly with your body heat. The texture is not luxurious, but it is familiar. You smooth it down, aware that this single layer may be the only one that touches your skin directly all day. Next comes wool. If you are a woman, you lace yourself into stays, the structured undergarment that supports posture and shapes the torso. Contrary to dramatic modern myths, most everyday stays are not designed to crush your ribs into submission. They provide firm support, distributing the weight of outer clothing. You tug the laces tighter, feeling your back straighten almost automatically. Breathing changes slightly, you adapt. If you are a man, you step into breeches that fasten at the knee. You pull on stockings, rolling them carefully to avoid sagging. The knit wool hugs your calves, faintly itchy but undeniably warm. A waistcoat follows, then a coat if you can afford one. The weight settles across your shoulders like a quiet responsibility. In colder months, layers multiply: cloaks, shawls, knitted caps, gloves if you are fortunate. In warmer weather, you remove what you can, though modesty and social expectations still dictate coverage. You learn to read status in fabric. Fine silk whispers wealth. Coarse wool announces labour. Of blue, red, yellow and green. Though they're of blue, red, yellow and green, though their brightness faded with repeated washing and sunlight. You might imagine the past in muted browns and greys, but markets and festivals could be surprisingly vivid. Still, historians continue to debate how widespread such brightness was among the poorest classes who may have relied on undyed or repeatedly repurposed garments. You tie an apron around your waist if you expect to work. It protects the layers beneath from flour, soot or soil. Aprons become almost symbolic of industry, always ready to wipe hands or cradle gathered vegetables. Shoes come last. They are stiff leather shaped by use more than comfort. There is no cushioned sole waiting to soften each step. You feel the ground through them. Mud seeps in during heavy rain. In rural areas, wooden clogs might replace leather clattering loudly against stone. Each footfall becomes part of the soundscape of the village. A quirky fragment from the era reveals that second-hand clothing markets thrived in many European cities. Garments passed from one owner to another, altered, patched and reshaped. Nothing was wasted. Fabric represented labour and expense. You might inherit a coat from a relative or purchase a skirt that once belonged to someone of slightly higher status. You adjust it to fit, quite literally wearing another person's history. Washing clothing is a serious undertaking. Laundry days require hauling water, heating it over a fire, scrubbing linen against rough boards and hanging it carefully to dry. Soap is often homemade from animal fat and ash. The scent is sharp and slightly alkaline. You learn to recognize the smell of a clean linen as a small triumph. Accessories matter too. A hat shields you from sun and rain. It also signals your place in society. In towns, removing your hat in the presence of a social superior is expected. You feel the subtle choreography of respect woven into these gestures. Clothing becomes language. You step outside again, fully dressed, and immediately notice how your garments shape your movement. Stays encourage upright posture. Heavy skirts restrict long strides. Breeches and stockings demand measured steps. You cannot sprint easily. You plan your pace accordingly. A common understanding among social historians is that clothing functioned as a visible map of hierarchy. Laws in earlier centuries had even attempted to regulate who could wear certain fabrics or colours. By the 18th century, enforcement had softened in many places, yet expectations remained strong. You are careful not to appear above your station. Such ambition displayed too boldly in silk or lace could invite gossip or worse. At the same time, fashion trickles downward. Styles worn in royal courts influence urban elites, then filter slowly into provincial towns. You may not own a powdered wig or an elaborately embroidered coat, but you recognize the silhouette. You adapt what you can within your means. As the day warms, you feel the subtle discomfort of sweat beneath wool. The linen layer absorbs it, becoming slightly damp. There is no quick change into breathable synthetic fabric. You endure. In winter, the same wool becomes your shield, trapping precious warmth against your body. Scholars still argue whether the average person perceived these garments primarily as constraint or as security. On one hand, layers restrict and weigh you down. On the other, they protect against cold injury and social misstep. Perhaps the answer depends on the season or your mood. You glance down at your hands. They are already roughened from previous labour. Fabric rubs against calloused skin without ceremony. Clothing does not hide the marks of work, it frames them. As you walk through the village or along a country path, you notice others dressed in similar layers. Slight variations marking age, wealth and trade. A blacksmith's leather apron, baker's dusted sleeves, a merchant's finer coat. You read each other at a glance. And in this quiet ritual of dressing, you begin to understand something essential about endurance in this century. Survival is not only about food and shelter, it is about fabric against skin, about laces tightened and buttons fastened, about stepping into garments that declare who you are before you ever speak. The day stretches ahead and your clothing moves with you creasing at the elbows, brushing against door frames, catching the faint scent of smoke as you pass a hearth. Each layer carries the memory of yesterday and the promise of tomorrow. You do not dress for leisure. You dress to endure, and in the steady rhythm of tying lacing and stepping into worn leather shoes, you prepare yourself once again to meet whatever this century quietly demands. Fully dressed, you turn your thoughts to something even more pressing than wool against your skin. Food, the quiet, persistent question that hums beneath every hour of your day. What will you eat, and will it be enough? You step back into the main room where a pot already simmers gently over the fire. Breakfast is not a lavish spread. It's often bread, perhaps dipped in weak beer or watered milk, sometimes porridge if grain is plentiful. You lift a wooden spoon and stir. The mixture thickens slowly, releasing a faint nutty scent. It is simple, filling, and repetitive. You eat not for pleasure but for strength. It is well documented that bread formed the backbone of the European diet during the 18th century. In many regions, it provided the majority of daily calories, especially for labouring families. The type of bread varied by wealth and geography. The wealthy enjoyed lighter loaves made from finely sifted wheat flour. The poor relied on darker, denser bread made from rye barley or a mixture of grains. Sometimes peas or even ground chestnuts stretched the flour further. You tear off a piece of yesterday's loaf. It is firm, slightly sour and substantial. You chew slowly, aware that each bite matters. A failed harvest or rising grain prices could turn this ordinary breakfast into a luxury almost overnight. Are years when bread grows scarce, and it's our years when bread grows scarce, and its price rises beyond what you can comfortably pay. In some cities, bread riots erupt when rumours spread that merchants are hoarding grain. You might find yourself in a tense crowd outside a bakery, voices raised fear mingling with anger. There is an odd historical detail that sometimes surprises modern listeners. In parts of France, officials once posted the daily price of bread publicly to reassure citizens that it was fair. Bread was not just food, it was political. You can almost imagine yourself scanning that posted price, calculating whether your coins will stretch. If you are fortunate, your breakfast includes more than grain. A bit of cheese, perhaps sharp and crumbly, maybe a slice of cured meat saved from last autumn's slaughter. In rural areas, milk and butter offer additional nourishment when cows are producing well. In coastal regions, fish might appear more frequently. Diet is local. It depends on soil climate and trade routes. You step outside after eating and notice the scent drifting from a nearby home. Someone is baking. The smell of fresh bread is rich and almost sweet, filling the lane. With a warmth that briefly eclipses the morning chill, it is a scent that promises comfort even when times are lean. A curious aside from this period is that in some households, families baked large batches of bread only once a week, or even less often, using communal ovens. The loaves were designed to last, growing harder as days passed. Stale bread might be softened in soup or broth. Nothing is wasted. Midday brings another meal, though it may be modest. Stew is common, a pot kept going with whatever ingredients are available. Cabbage, onions, carrots, perhaps a handful of beans. Meat, when present, is stretched thin. You ladle it into a bowl, steam rising gently. The broth is savoury, sometimes slightly bitter if herbs have been added. You savour it anyway. Researchers continue to examine how varied the diet truly was across social classes and regions. While the stereotype of endless cabbage and bread holds some truth, for the poorest trade networks were expanding during this century. Sugar tea, coffee and chocolate increasingly appear in urban mountain centres, though often as luxuries. If you are wealthy, you might sip sweetened chocolate in the morning, a novelty that feels almost indulgent. If you are poor, you may only hear about such pleasures. You pause and consider hunger not as a dramatic famine, but as a low, persistent companion. There are days when your portion feels slightly too small. You tell yourself it is enough. You drink water or thin ale to fill the space in your stomach. Ale is safer than untreated water in many towns, brewed lightly and consumed daily. It carries a faint tang, mild and cloudy. Another intriguing practice from the time involves the use of spices, not only for flavour, but to mask the taste of food beginning to spoil. Pepper, cloves and nutmeg travelled long distances and commanded high prices. To sprinkle them generously over a dish signalled wealth. To rely on them occasionally to disguise age signalled practicality. You notice how meals structure your day. Work pauses briefly. Families gather, even if only for a few minutes. Conversation flows softly. Complaints about weather, speculation about crops, small jokes. Food becomes the thread that stitches hours together. There is ongoing academic discussion about how conscious people were of nutritional balance. Modern categories of vitamins and proteins did not exist yet. Communities developed food traditions that in many cases provided sufficient sustenance. Fermented foods, seasonal vegetables, preserved meats. Knowledge passed through generations, practical rather than theoretical. As evening approaches, you feel the weight of the day's labour in your muscles. Supper resembles midday fare. Perhaps leftovers from the stew thickened slightly. Perhaps a simple pottage of grains boiled again. You eat by firelight shadows dancing along the walls. The taste is familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. You think briefly of feast days, religious festivals or weddings when tables groan with abundance, roasted meat, sweet pastries, spiced wine. These occasions stand out precisely because they are rare. They shimmer in memory, carrying you through plainer weeks. You set down your spoon and wipe your mouth with the back of your hand or a corner of linen. Your stomach is neither overfull nor entirely satisfied. It is simply steady. And in this century, steady is often enough. As you rise from the table, you understand that enduring daily life here means learning to measure contentment differently. Bread that does not mold too quickly, a pot that stretches through the week, a harvest that ripens on time. Each small success keeps a hunger at bay. The fire crackles softly. The scent of cabbage lingers in the air. Outside, the sky darkens toward evening. Tomorrow you will wake and eat again, repeating the ritual. Not glamorous, not extravagant, but quietly essential. And in that repetition you find the rhythm that carries you forward. After bread and broth have settled in your stomach, another quiet concern waits its turn. Water. You cannot ignore it, though you might wish you could. It is heavy to carry, uncertain in purity, and absolutely essential. You step outside with a wooden bucket in hand. The handle presses into your palm as you walk toward the village well or the communal pump. The air is cooler now, or perhaps you simply notice it more as you brace yourself for the effort. Drawing water is not a decorative ritual. It is daily labour repeated without applause. In many 18th century towns, access to clean water was inconsistent. Wells provided supply, but their safety depended on depth construction and distance from waste. In crowded cities, contamination was a constant risk. A widely accepted historical observation is that urban sanitation lagged far behind population growth, especially in rapidly expanding capitals. Waste disposal systems were rudimentary and runoff could seep into groundwater. You lower the bucket and listen to the faint splash as it meets the surface below. You pull steadily, feeling the rope strain against the weight. Muscles in your shoulders tighten. When the bucket emerges, water sloshes over the rim, cool and clear to the eye. Clarity, however, does not guarantee safety. You know that sometimes illness follows a seemingly harmless drink. Back inside, you set the bucket near the hearth. Some of the water will be boiled for cooking, which helps reduce risk. Some will be used for washing hands and faces. You pour a little into a basin and dip a cloth into it. The water bites at your skin with its chill. You wipe your neck, your wrists, the back of your ears. It is not a full bath, but it refreshes you. Contrary to certain dramatic myths, people of this era did value cleanliness. They changed linen undergarments regularly when possible, aired bedding, and washed visible parts of the body. What differed was the frequency and method of full immersion bathing. Heating enough water for a tub required time and fuel, and privacy was limited in many homes. As a result, washing often focused on practical areas rather than luxurious soaking. A small but fascinating detail from household records reveals that scented herbs were sometimes added to wash water or scattered on floors to freshen the air. Lavender, rosemary, and thyme offered fragrance and a hint of reassurance. You might crush a sprig between your fingers, releasing a sharp green scent that briefly masks the smoke and dampness. Laundry looms as a larger task. You picture a designated day when garments are gathered, sorted, and carried to a stream or large basin. Soap made from rendered fat and lye, derived from wood ash, has a pungent, almost metallic smell. You scrub fabric against a ridged board, working out stains with determined strokes. The motion is repetitive, meditative, and tiring. Your hands redden in cold water, knuckles crack. In rural areas, washing might take place beside a river, garments spread across bushes or lines to dry in open air. In cities, communal washhouses buzz with conversation and splashing. News travels quickly in these spaces. Gossip mixes with steam. There is scholarly disagreement about how often full-body baths occurred among different classes and regions. Some evidence suggests that in certain areas public bathhouses remained in use, though less common than in earlier centuries. Elsewhere, bathing habits shifted over time due to changing beliefs about health. You sense that attitudes are not uniform. They vary by climate, by custom, by personal inclination. You lift a wooden comb and draw it through your hair. Lice are an unwelcome reality for many. Fine-toothed combs serve as both grooming tools and quiet weapons against infestation. You sit near the light of a window or candle, methodically working through strands. It is intimate, unglamorous labour. Teeth receive attention too, though not with mint-flavoured paste. A cloth rubbed with salt or crushed charcoal might serve to clean them. The taste is sharp, slightly gritty. You rinse and spit discreetly into the yard. An unexpected curiosity from the period involves the use of wigs among fashionable men. Powdered and carefully styled, they concealed thinning hair and signalled status. Yet beneath those elegant curls, hygiene could be complicated. Wigs required maintenance, and their popularity fluctuated with the changing tastes and practical concerns. As the day warms, you become more aware of scent. Smoke clings to your clothing, sweat gathers beneath wool. Animals in nearby yards contribute their own presence to the air. You do what you can within the limits of time and resources. Windows are opened when weather allows. Bedding is aired outside on clear days, sunlight acting as a quiet purifier. Public perception of cleanliness is layered with social meaning. To appear excessively concerned with bathing might be seen as vanity in some circles, while neglecting visible grime invites criticism. You walk a narrow line maintaining respectability without extravagance. Researchers examining personal letters have noted how frequently illness was attributed to bad air or miasma, rather than unseen microbes. This belief shapes your habits. You worry about foul smells more than invisible bacteria. Fresh air feels protective, stagnant odours raise unease. You step outside again carrying a smaller bucket to pour water over a patch of swept earth. The ground darkens, dust settling. A sense of order returns. You hang damp linen on a line, watching it flutter gently in the breeze. The fabric moves like pale flags against the sky. In the evening, when you return from labour, you repeat small rituals. Hands washed before supper. Face wiped before bed. It is not spa indulgence, it is maintenance. You accept the limitations without bitterness. As twilight softens the edges of the village, you reflect on how endurance here includes constant negotiation with the elements. Water sustains you and threatens you. Cleanliness comforts you and demands effort. You do not conquer these forces, you work alongside them. The bucket rests by the door once more, half full, ready for tomorrow's needs. The scent of lavender lingers faintly on your hands. The air inside feels slightly fresher than before. It is a small victory, barely noticeable to anyone else, yet deeply felt by you. And in these quiet acts of drawing, boiling, scrubbing, and airing, you participate in a daily choreography that keeps illness at bay as best it can. Not perfectly, not always successfully, but persistently. You prepare for sleep, knowing that at dawn the rope will creak again over the well, and you will once more lift water from darkness into light. With your clothes settled against your skin and water drawn for the day, you turn toward the long stretch of labour that defines nearly every waking hour. Work is not a separate category of life here. It is life. It hums beneath conversation, shapes your posture, and decides when you may rest. You step into the fields if you live in the countryside. The earth smells damp and rich beneath your boots. A faint mist lingers over rows of crops silvered by early light. Your hands close around a wooden tool, perhaps a hoe or a scythe worn smooth where countless fingers have gripped it before yours. A commonly accepted historical understanding is that the majority of Europeans in the 18th century still lived in rural areas and depended directly on agriculture for survival. The land feeds you, but it demands relentless attention. You bend, lift, pull. The rhythm settles into your muscles. Birds call from hedgerows. Insects hum near your ears. Sweat forms along your spine beneath linen and wool. There is no quick shade break unless you carve it out yourself. You pause only briefly to straighten your back, pressing a hand into the small of it, then return to the task. If you live in a town, your labour takes a different shape but is no less consuming. You might apprentice in a workshop, learning a craft from a master who watches your every movement. The air smells of sawdust, leather, or hot metal depending on the trade. Hammer strikes ring sharply against iron. Threads stretch taut across looms, clicking in steady patterns. The sound becomes almost hypnotic. Guild systems in many cities regulate trades, controlling who may practice a craft and under what conditions. This structure offers some stability, though. It also limits opportunity. You work long hours to prove your skill, hoping one day to earn the right to call yourself master rather than apprentice. Advancement is possible, yet never guaranteed. For women, labour often unfolds in layers. You may tend a small garden, spin wool into thread, cook, clean, and care for children, all within the same day. Spinning wheels whir softly in corners of cottages, transforming raw fibre into something useful. A factual cornerstone of the era is that much textile production still occurred in homes, through what historians call the putting out system, where merchants supplied raw materials to families who worked them into finished goods. Your fingers grow nimble, twisting fibres with practiced precision. An unexpected note from court records reveals that disputes over unpaid wages or defective goods were common. Work was not always harmonious. Contracts existed, sometimes informal, sometimes written, and arguments flared when expectations clashed. You might find yourself standing before a local official explaining why your employer still owes you coins promised weeks ago. The hours stretch. There is no clear division between 9 and 5. Instead, daylight dictates your schedule. In summer, that can mean very long days indeed. You measure time by the position of the sun, by the call of church bells, by the ache settling into your shoulders. There is ongoing discussion among social historians about how people perceived this intensity of labour. Did they view it as unremarkable, simply the structure of existence, or did they quietly long for lighter burdens? Personal diaries sometimes hint at exhaustion, yet they also speak of pride in craftsmanship and harvest. You feel both at once, tired and necessary. You pause midday to eat a small portion of bread or stew, then back to the field or bench you go. If you are a domestic servant in a wealthier household, your tasks multiply according to the preferences of your employers. Polishing silver until it gleams, scrubbing floors with stiff brushes, carrying water upstairs and ashes down, you move quietly aware that your livelihood depends on discretion as much as diligence. The physical toll accumulates slowly. Calluses thicken, shoulders broaden, knees protest when you kneel too long, yet there is resilience in repetition. Your body adapts to demands placed upon it. Tools are precious. A well-forged plough blade, a sturdy loom, a reliable hammer. They are repaired rather than discarded. You learn to mend what breaks. Resourcefulness becomes second nature. A small curiosity from rural lore suggests that some farmers paid close attention to phases of the moon when planting certain crops, believing that lunar cycles influence growth. Whether grounded in observation or tradition, these practices reveal how closely labour and nature intertwine in your daily thinking. As afternoon light shifts toward the gold, fatigue deepens. The air cools slightly. You glance toward the horizon, calculating how much more can be accomplished before darkness. There is satisfaction in a field neatly weeded or a batch of cloth completed. Tangible results anchor your effort. In towns, workshops begin to quiet as shutters close. The last sparks fade in the forge. In villages, tools are gathered and stored carefully. You wipe sweat from your brow with your sleeve. Your stomach reminds you that it will soon require another meal. You walk home with a slower stride. The ground feels uneven beneath tired feet. Smoke curls upward from chimneys signalling supper's underway. Children's voices drift faintly through open doors. The scent of cooking cabbage or roasting meat greets you like an old companion. Work does not fully end even now. Animals must be fed, water fetched again, minor repairs handled before nightfall, but the most intense exertion has passed. As you sit near the hearth once more, you consider how endurance here is measured not in dramatic feats but in accumulated hours, in the steady willingness to rise each morning and repeat movements that rarely change. In the quiet pride of seeing something built, planted, spun, or cleaned by your own hands. The fire crackles softly. Your muscles hum with fatigue, yet it is a familiar hum. Outside twilight settles gently over fields and rooftops. Tomorrow will demand the same from you. And somehow you will answer, because in this century labour is not optional. It is the thread that stitches one day to the next, binding you to land, craft, and community, with a strength that feels both heavy and deeply human. The ache in your shoulders fades slightly as evening approaches, and with it comes a different kind of energy. Not rest exactly, but exchange, trade, conversation. The market is the pulse that keeps your town or village alive, and when you step into it, you feel that pulse quicken around you. You walk toward the central square, or the wide stretch of packed earth where stalls are already forming neat or not so neat rows. Canvas awnings flap softly in the breeze. Wooden tables creak under the weight of goods. Voices rise and overlap in a steady hum that feels almost musical. After a day of solitary labour in field or workshop, the market reminds you that you are part of something larger. A firmly grounded historical reality is that weekly markets were essential across 18th century Europe, especially for those who could not produce everything they needed themselves. Even in rural regions, periodic markets connected villages to broader trade networks. You might arrive carrying eggs, spun thread, or surplus vegetables, hoping to exchange them for salt tools or a small luxury like dried fruit. The smells greet you first. Fresh bread, sharp cheese, smoked fish, damp wool leather, and occasionally the sweet surprise of imported spices. Cinnamon and cloves, rare and precious, drift faintly from a merchant's stall. You pause there, inhaling deeply. Such scents carry whispers of distant colonies and long sea voyages. You run your fingers over bolts of cloth stacked neatly on a table. The texture varies from coarse homespun to smoother weaves dyed in deeper colours. The merchant watches your expression closely. Haggling as expected. Coins change hands carefully. Every purchase is weighed against necessity. An intriguing detail found in trade records reveals how interconnected Europe had become by this period. Sugar from the Caribbean, tea from Asia, tobacco from the Americas all found their way into urban markets, though, often at prices that restricted them to wealthier buyers. You might see a small sack of coffee beans and feel a flicker of curiosity. Perhaps you have tasted it once, bitter and dark, a flavour that lingers long after the cup is empty. Children dart between stalls, chasing one another, or clutching small coins entrusted to them by parents. A fiddler stands near the edge of the square bow, gliding across strings, adding a lively rhythm to the air. Markets are not only about goods, they are about spectacle. In towns, regulations attempt to impose order. Officials inspect weights and measures to prevent fraud. There are designated days and spaces for different types of vendors. Yet chaos always seeps in around the edges. Arguments erupt over price or quality. A pig breaks free from its tether and scampers through the crowd, prompting laughter and shouted curses. Historians continue to examine how markets shaped social mobility. Did they offer genuine opportunity for small producers to improve their circumstances, or did established merchants dominate trade in ways that limited advancement? As you stand there with your modest basket of goods, you sense both possibility and constraint. You exchange a handful of eggs for a small wedge of cheese. The vendor wraps it in cloth and nods. Transactions are often personal, you know these faces. Trust builds over time. Reputation matters. A curious anecdote from court archives mentions disputes over counterfeit coins circulating in certain regions. You glance down at the metal in your palm, turning it in the light, aware that its value depends entirely on collective belief. Money feels tangible, yet fragile. Beyond food and fabric, the market carries news. You overhear snippets of conversation about distant wars, rising taxes, a royal marriage, or a failed harvest in a neighbouring province. Printed pamphlets sometimes appear sold cheaply, spreading political ideas or sensational stories. You might not read fluently, but someone nearby can, and they read aloud for a small crowd. The words ripple outward, shaping opinions. There is also the quieter economy of favours and barter, a promise to mend a fence in exchange for help during harvest, an agreement to share a cart for the next journey to town. These arrangements do not always involve coin. They rely on memory and mutual obligation. As afternoon light softens, the market shifts. Some stalls pack away unsold goods, others drop prices in hopes of avoiding waste. The fiddler plays a slower tune. Laughter rises from a group gathered near a tavern door. The energy changes from brisk transaction to lingering conversation. Researchers have pointed out that markets served as rare spaces where different social classes might briefly intersect. A noble passing through to town might purchase produce alongside artisans and farmers. Though hierarchy remains visible in dress and demeanour, proximity blurs edges for a moment. You tuck your small purchases into a basket and begin the walk home. The square empties gradually behind you. Scraps of straw and vegetable leaves scatter across the ground. The scent of trampled herbs lingers. As you move away, you realise how essential these gatherings are to endurance. They break isolation. They allow you to compare your struggles with others, to measure your fortunes against the broader community. If grain prices are rising everywhere, your anxiety feels shared rather than singular. Back inside your home, you unwrap the cheese and cut a modest slice for supper. Its sharpness brightens the familiar taste of bread. You think of the merchant's stall, the noise, the colour, the sense of motion. Trade does more than fill your pantry. It connects you to distant lands and nearby neighbours alike. It carries risk, opportunity, rumour and relief all at once. The fire burns lower as evening settles. Outside the square grows quiet, awaiting the next market day, when voices will once again rise and goods will change hands beneath open sky. And you, like countless others, will return to that shared space, stepping into the lively current of exchange that keeps daily life in this century moving forward. You leave the fading bustle of the market behind and step once more into the intimate world of home. The door closes with a soft scrape against the floor, and suddenly the noise of trade gives way to the smaller sounds of family life. A spoon tapping against a bowl, a child whispering to a sibling, the low murmur of someone recounting the day's events. Space is limited here. You feel it immediately. The room holds not only furniture but people, each carrying their own fatigue and quiet thoughts. In many 18th century households, especially among the working classes, multiple generations lived beneath one roof. This arrangement was not unusual, but expected. A widely recognised demographic pattern shows that extended families often pooled resources, sharing labour and shelter as a practical necessity. You set your basket on the table and begin dividing the contents. The cheese from the market is sliced carefully thin enough to stretch across several pieces of bread. Eyes watch the distribution not greedily but attentively. Everyone knows how much there is and how long it must last. As evening deepens, the hearth becomes the centre of gravity. You pull a stool closer to the fire. Someone else spreads straw pallets on the floor or checks the ropes beneath the bed frame to ensure they remain taut. Beds are rarely solitary spaces. It is common for siblings to share, for children to sleep near parents, for servants to rest in the same room as those they serve if the household is small. Privacy is a luxury few can afford. There is a small, almost tender detail recorded in it is letters from the period that reveals how families often developed unspoken sleeping arrangements. The youngest might claim the warmest spot near the fire in winter. Older children turn toward the wall, offering a modest gesture of discretion when adults speak quietly after dark. These small negotiations create order without formal rules. You sit beside a child who leans against your shoulder. Their hair smells faintly of smoke and soap. You feel the steady rhythm of their breathing as they grow drowsy. The day's labour has tired them as much as it has you. Childhood here does not float above responsibility. It is woven into it. A commonly acknowledged aspect of family life in this century is the high rate of child mortality. Illness visits frequently, and not every child survives to adulthood. This reality shapes affection in complicated ways. Some historians suggest that parents guarded their emotions to protect themselves from grief. Others point to diaries and letters filled with deep tenderness and sorrow, evidence that love was neither distant nor restrained. As you look at the small figure beside you, you sense that attachment is unavoidable no matter the risk. Conversation drifts around the room. News from the market, speculation about the coming harvest, a neighbour's misfortune. Laughter erupts briefly when someone recounts a minor mishap with a stubborn goat or a spilled bucket of milk. Humour becomes a quiet form of endurance. You notice how roles distribute themselves almost automatically. One person mends a torn sleeve by firelight needle flashing in and out of fabric. Another peels vegetables for tomorrow's meal. A child practices letters on a scrap of paper if the family can afford schooling. Education is uneven across regions, but literacy is gradually spreading, particularly in urban areas. Books remain expensive, yet printed materials are more available than in previous centuries. An unusual yet documented custom in some European communities involved telling moral tales or reciting prayers collectively before sleep. These moments reinforce shared belief and identity. You bow your head as words rise softly around you. The rhythm is familiar, almost soothing. Tension, of course, also resides in close quarters. Disagreements flare more easily when there is no separate room to retreat to. A sharp word can echo against low ceilings. Yet reconciliation often follows quickly because distance is impossible. You learn to forgive with efficiency. Researchers examining household inventories have noted how few possessions most families owned, a chest, a table, perhaps a clock if fortune allowed. Each item carries weight. You glance at a single candle set carefully on the table. Its flame flickers, casting long shadows across faces that have shared countless evenings together. As bedding is arranged, you feel the choreography of night begin. Shoes placed near the door, aprons folded, tools set aside, the fire banked carefully to preserve embers for morning. You slip beneath blankets that retain the day's faint warmth. The straw mattress rustles as you settle. Beside you, another body shifts, adjusting to create space. You're aware of breathing patterns, of the subtle rise and fall of chests in the dim light. It is impossible to feel entirely alone here. For some, that proximity comforts. For others, it weighs heavily. Scholars continue to explore how such constant closeness shaped emotional bonds and personal boundaries in ways quite different from modern expectations. A faint draft slips through the window, opening, brushing your cheek. Someone pulls the blanket higher. A final whisper crosses the room, then quiet begins to claim its place. In this shared darkness, you understand that endurance is not solely physical. It is relational. You rely on one another for warmth, for labour, for laughter, for survival. The walls may be thin and the space narrow, but within them unfolds a network of obligations and affections that steadies you against uncertainty. As sleep approaches, you feel the solid presence of family around you. The market's noise has faded, and the day's work has ended. What remains is this small circle of light and breath gathered beneath timber beams holding fast against the wider world. And in that closeness you find both challenge and comfort, woven tightly together, like the threads of linen beneath your hands. Morning arrives again with little ceremony, and this time your attention settles not on your own stiff muscles, but on the smaller figures already stirring near the hearth. Childhood in 18th century Europe does not unfold in a separate brightly coloured world. It is threaded directly into the fabric of adult responsibility, sometimes almost indistinguishable from it. You watch as a child rubs sleep from their eyes and reaches automatically for a task. There is no slow drifting into cartoons or idle scrolling. A bucket must be carried. Chickens must be fed. Kindling must be gathered from a woodpile damp with dew. From an early age, children contribute in ways that feel ordinary rather than exceptional. A well-established demographic fact is that families in this period were often large, though survival into adulthood was far from guaranteed. High birth rates coexisted with significant infant and child mortality. This reality shapes expectations. You grow up quickly because time itself feels uncertain. You step outside and see a boy no older than 8 guiding a small flock of geese with a stick, his expression serious-focused. A girl of similar age balances a basket on her hip, heading toward the well. Their movements are not playful in the modern sense, yet neither are they entirely joyless. They have absorbed the rhythm of work simply by being present within it. In towns, children might apprentice at surprisingly young ages. By 10 or 12, some are already learning a trade, sweeping workshop floors, running errands, observing masters at work. Contracts are sometimes formalized with signatures or marks. Parents negotiate terms, hoping to secure a stable future for their child. Whether that future unfolds as hoped is another matter entirely. There is a small but striking detail recorded in parish archives that reveals how children were occasionally listed not just by name but by occupation even before adolescence. Shepherd, spear, errand boy. These labels hint at how identity forms early around labour. Education exists though unevenly distributed. In certain regions, particularly parts of Northern Europe, literacy rates rise steadily during the 18th century. Charity schools and parish schools teach basic reading and religious instruction. You imagine sitting on a hard bench, slate in hand, tracing letters with careful concentration. Ink stains fingertips. The smell of chalk dust lingers in the air. Yet schooling competes with necessity. If harvest approaches or illness reduces the number of working hands, lessons are postponed. Scholars continue to examine how families balance the promise of literacy against the immediate need for income or assistance at home. The answer likely varies from village to village. You notice how play slips into the margins of duty. Children invent games with stone sticks, scraps of cloth. They chase one another briefly between chores. Laughter bursts out unexpectedly, then fades as a parent calls them back to work. Toys, when they exist, are simple. A carved wooden figure, a rag doll stitched from leftover fabric. These objects are treasured precisely because, for kids, they are rare. An unusual anecdote from the period describes children racing hoops down cobbled streets, guiding them with sticks in energetic competition. The image is vivid. Wooden circles clattering bare feet slapping against stone, breathless joy echoing between buildings. Even in constrained circumstances, imagination finds space. Discipline, however, is firm. Authority flows downward with little room for negotiation. Corporal punishment is widely accepted as a means of correction. You sense the tension in a child's posture when an adult voice sharpens. Obedience is linked not only to respect but to survival in a world that punishes mistakes harshly. Religion shapes childhood profoundly. Catechisms are memorized. Prayers recited. Moral instruction woven into daily conversation. You watch a small child bow their head, eyes squeezed shut in earnest concentration. Faith offers both comfort and structure. Clothing for children often mirrors adult styles scaled down. There is little sense of a separate fashion for youth. Once past infancy, boys and girls dress much like their elders, signalling the expectation that they will soon share adult responsibilities fully. You kneel to tie a loose lace on a child's shoe and notice how quickly their hands have grown rough from chores. These are not sheltered palms. They bear small cuts, faint scars, evidence of participation in the daily grind. At the same time, affection surfaces in quiet gestures. A mother smoothing hair back from a fevered forehead. A father lifting a tired child onto his shoulders after a long walk. Despite high mortality rates, evidence from letters and household accounts suggests that parental attachment was deep and heartfelt. The idea that people loved less because they risked losing more is increasingly questioned by modern researchers. As evening falls, children grow visibly weary. Eyelids droop while adults continue to speak. A small head rests against your knee. You guide them gently toward bedding arranged near the hearth. They curl instinctively toward warmth. Before sleep claims them, you hear whispered dreams of future trades, of imagined adventures, of markets and festivals yet to be experienced. Childhood here may be brief and bounded by duty, but it is not devoid of aspiration. You lie back and consider how endurance in this century begins early. Skills are learned not through abstract theory but through repetition. Responsibility arrives before adolescence, yet resilience grows alongside it. Outside, the night air settles cool against the walls. Inside, children breathe softly in shared space already preparing to rise with dawn. Tomorrow they will carry water again, sweep floors again, tend animals again. And in those repetitions they will become the adults who sustain this fragile, demanding world. You close your eyes, aware that within these small bodies rests the continuation of everything around you. The fields, the markets, the homes of timber and stone all depend on hands that are still learning their strength. And so the cycle turns quietly onward, guided by children who have never known a different pace of life. As children drift into sleep and the fire settles into a low amber glow, your thoughts wander toward a different thread woven tightly through daily life. Marriage, partnership, the quiet negotiations that shape who shares your bed, your bread, and your burdens. You remember that in this century, marriage is rarely framed as a purely romantic adventure. Affection certainly exists, sometimes deeply and sincerely, but practical considerations stand firmly beside it. Land trade connections, dowries, inheritance. These are not cold calculations in the eyes of those living them. They are safeguards against hardship. A broadly documented social pattern shows that across much of 18th century Europe, people tended to marry later than many assume, often in their mid to late 20s. This was particularly true in northwestern regions where young adults frequently worked as servants or labourers before establishing independent households. You might spend years saving coins, building skill and waiting for the right moment to step into the marriage with at least a modest foundation. Courtship unfolds under watchful eyes. There are no private apartments for whispered confessions. Conversations happen in shared rooms, on doorsteps, in fields at dusk where others are never far away. You sit beside someone on a bench near the hearth, aware of siblings pretending not to listen. Words are chosen carefully. Gestures are restrained. There is a small but charming detail recorded in some rural traditions involving tokens of affection. A young man might carve a simple wooden spoon or present a ribbon as a sign of interest. A young woman might embroider initials discreetly into linen. These objects carry meaning without spectacle. In wealthier circles, negotiations can be more formal. Contracts are drawn. Dowries discussed at length. Families weigh advantages. Love may grow later, or it may already be present, but it is rarely the sole criterion. You feel the weight of expectation pressing gently on your shoulders. Marriage is not just about companionship, it is about survival, reputation, continuity. Researchers continue to examine how much agency individuals truly had in choosing their partners. In some regions, parental approval is essential. In others, couples exert more influence, particularly when they can demonstrate economic readiness. The reality is not uniform. It shifts with class, culture, and circumstance. You recall a curious anecdote from village folklore describing the custom of charivari, where communities would noisily mock mismatched or socially disapproved unions by banging pots and pans outside newlyweds' homes. The line between celebration and social policing is thin. Community involvement in marriage can be supportive or intrusive depending on the situation. When the wedding day arrives, it is often a bright interruption in ordinary routine. Even modest ceremonies carry a sense of importance. Bells ring, tahui, neighbours gather, food is shared more generously than usual. For a brief moment, the relentless cadence of work pauses, then daily life resumes. You wake the next morning not as a character in a romance, but as a partner in labour. Tasks are divided, sometimes along gendered lines deeply embedded in custom. You might plough fields while your spouse manages household production, or the reverse in certain trades. You learn each other's habits quickly because space offers no room for mystery. Intimacy unfolds within the same shared rooms where children sleep and elders rest. Privacy is negotiated rather than guaranteed. Curtains turned back, soft whispers. There is tenderness here, though it must adapt to circumstance. A historical constant is that marriage establishes legal and economic frameworks that affect property and inheritance. In many regions, a woman's legal identity merges partially with her husband's upon marriage, though variations exist depending on local law. These structures influence power dynamics within households in ways both subtle and overt. Disagreements occur, of course. Stress over money crops or illness can strain even strong bonds. Yet separation is not easily pursued, especially among the poor. Social stigma and financial impossibility tether couples together. Endurance within marriage becomes another form of daily resilience. You sit beside your partner as the fire dwindles. You share a quiet look that contains more than words. Mutual fatigue, shared worry, perhaps shared hope. In this century, companionship often grows through shared struggle rather than through grand declarations. Letters from the period reveal surprising warmth between spouses, challenging assumptions that practical marriages lacked affection. Phrases of endearment appear in ink faded by time, promises of loyalty, expressions of longing when separated by travel or war. Love exists here, shaped by necessity but not extinguished by it. You stretch out on your bedding and feel another presence close by. Breathing aligns gradually in the dark. Outside, the village settles into silence. Marriage in this world is less about cinematic romance and more about partnership against uncertainty. It is two sets of hands lifting the same bucket of water, two minds calculating grain stores, two hearts steadying each other when illness strikes. As sleep approaches, you recognize that enduring daily life in this century often depends on such alliances. You are rarely meant to stand alone. Instead, you weave your fate together with another's, hoping that the combined strength will carry you both through winter-cold market fluctuations and the endless rhythm of work. The embers glow faintly one last time before fading. Tomorrow you will rise side by side and begin again, bound not only by vows spoken once before witnesses, but by the quiet, continuous choice to endure together. The night fades softly, and with it comes a new layer of rhythm that steadies your days more firmly than the rising sun alone. Faith. It settles over your life as naturally as the smoke that curls from your chimney, sometimes comforting, sometimes heavy, always present. You wake to the distant toll of a bell drifting through morning air. Its sound is clear and measured, carrying across fields and rooftops. In many parts of 18th century Europe, church bells regulated communal time, marking not only worship but hours of work and rest. You pause for a moment when you hear it, even if only to count the strokes. Time here is not a digital display, it is a shared echo. On certain days you dress with slightly more care. Linen freshly aired, shoes brushed free of mud. You walk toward the village church or urban parish building, its stone walls cool and imposing. The structure rises above smaller homes, a visible anchor in the landscape. Inside, the air smells faintly of wax and damp stone. Light filters through narrow windows, painting pale shapes across wooden pews. You take your place among neighbours. Social hierarchy remains visible even here. Wealthier families sit closer to the front, the poor cluster farther back, yet all faces turn toward the same altar. A foundational historical reality is that religion permeated daily existence across much of Europe during this period, though its intensity and form varied by region and confession. Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox communities each carried distinct traditions, yet all wove belief into routine. Attendance at services was often expected, sometimes legally required. You bow your head as prayers rise. The words are familiar, memorized from childhood. They offer structure in a world where so much feels uncertain. Harvests may fail. Illness may strike. Political upheaval may ripple through distant capitals. Faith provides a narrative that frames these events within divine order. There is an intimate detail recorded in parish accounts that reveals how sermons often addressed practical concerns, not only spiritual doctrine. Clergy spoke about fair dealings in markets, obedience within households, care for the poor. The boundary between sacred and secular life was porous. Music fills the space at times. Voices blend, sometimes strong and resonant, sometimes hesitant. Hymns carry emotion beyond spoken words. You feel the vibration in your chest as sound rises toward vaulted ceilings. Outside formal worship, belief threads quietly through ordinary moments. Before meals, you murmur gratitude. Before sleep, you ask for protection. A child recites a catechism answer with solemn pride. These small rituals shape identity. Researchers continue to explore how deeply personal faith differed from outward conformity. Did everyone believe with equal conviction, or did some attend simply to avoid social scrutiny? Diaries suggest a range of experiences. Some speak passionately of spiritual comfort. Others hint at doubt kept carefully hidden. Superstition and formal doctrine often coexist. You might cross yourself when thunder cracks overhead or whisper a quick prayer before embarking on a journey. An unusual but documented custom in certain regions involved placing protective charms above doorways to ward off misfortune. Official theology may not endorse such practices, yet they persist quietly. Church also functions as a social hub. After services, neighbours linger outside exchanging news. Marriage bans are announced publicly, inviting objections if any exist. Baptisms and funerals mark life's milestones within the same walls. You witness joy and grief in equal measure. Charitable support flows through religious institutions as well. Alms distributed to widows, bread shared with the destitute. Though resources are limited, communal responsibility finds expression here. There is also tension. In some regions, religious divisions run deep, shaped by centuries of conflict. Identity can be both comforting and divisive. You sense how belief aligns communities while sometimes separating them from others. A curious historical observation notes that even as Enlightenment ideas begin circulating through pamphlets and salons, regular church attendance remains robust in many areas. Intellectual currents and daily devotion exist side by side, not always in open conflict. As the service concludes, you step back into daylight. The bell tolls again, signalling dismissal. The square outside fills briefly with conversation. Children tug at sleeves. Elders lean on canes. The sacred hour blends seamlessly back into ordinary time. At home, faith continues in quieter forms. A small Bible rests on a shelf if the household can afford one. You trace its worn cover with your fingers. Stories within it shape moral imagination. They offer examples of endurance, suffering, redemption. You consider how belief influences decisions large and small, whom to trust, how to forgive, how to interpret hardship. In a world lacking modern medical explanations or economic safety nets, faith provides a framework that steadies anxiety. Night approaches once more. You kneel beside your bedding, hands clasped loosely. Words flow softly, not dramatic, not theatrical, simply habitual and sincere. Hostas, sincere. The candle flame flickers as you rise and lie down. Around you, others whisper their own petitions. The room grows still. In this century, endurance is not only physical labor and shared bread, it is also the quiet conviction that meaning exists beyond immediate hardship. Whether through ritual prayer or silent reflection, you anchor yourself to something larger than your own limited strength. The bell will ring again tomorrow. You will rise, work, eat, and return, and woven through it all will be this steady undercurrent of belief shaping your days as surely as timber beams and wool garments guiding you gently through uncertainty toward another dawn. You wake in the dark to a sound that does not belong to the ordinary rhythm of sleep. A cough. Not the brief clearing of a throat, but a strained, persistent rasp that seems to scrape the silence itself. You hold still, listening. Another breath follows, uneven and shallow. Illness does not announce itself politely in this century. It seeps into the room, settles near the hearth, lies down beside you without invitation. You rise quietly and cross the narrow space between bedding. The floor is cool beneath your feet. In the dim glow of banked embers, you see a face flushed too brightly. A hand reaches toward you, skin warm and slightly damp. Fever. A deeply rooted historical reality is that 18th century Europeans lived with a constant awareness of disease. Smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery, and countless fevers moved through communities with alarming regularity. Without antibiotics or modern vaccines, recovery depended on luck, resilience, and rudimentary medical knowledge. You fetch water from the bucket near the door and dip a cloth into it. The fabric clings to your fingers, then to the hot forehead before you. The child sighs faintly at the touch of coolness. Around you, others stir but do not fully wake. Illness here is rarely isolated. Close quarters mean close contact. The local healer or physician, if one is available, may be summoned at dawn. Their tools are simple. They might carry jars of dried herbs, vials of tinctures, perhaps a small case of instruments. Medical theory still rests largely on balancing bodily humours, an idea inherited from ancient sources. Bloodletting remains common practice in many regions believed to restore equilibrium. Researchers have noted that while some treatments seem misguided by modern standards, others possess genuine efficacy. Certain herbal preparations eased symptoms. Quinine derived from cinchona bark, for instance, offered relief against malarial fevers. Knowledge travelled slowly, unevenly shaped by trade and tradition. You sit beside the sickbed and count breaths. Outside dawn creeps into the sky indifferent to your worry. Work awaits, yet you cannot leave. Responsibilities rearrange themselves around vulnerability. A curious yet documented custom in some communities involved placing slices of onion or vinegar-soaked cloths in rooms believed to contain bad air. The scent was sharp and pungent, a sensory barrier against unseen threats. You might wrinkle your nose as you set such remedies nearby, hoping they offer protection. As morning unfolds, word spreads quietly. A neighbour knocks, offering broth or assistance. Illness draws both fear and solidarity. You accept help, gratefully aware that next time the roles may reverse. There remains ongoing scholarly conversation about how families understood contagion before germ theory. Many believe disease spread through miasma, foul air that clung to damp places and rotting matter. You opened a window slightly despite the chill, seeking fresh air as a safeguard. The sick child shifts restlessly. You murmur reassurance, though uncertainty presses against your chest. In this century, recovery can be swift and miraculous or heartbreakingly absent. You have seen both. If the illness worsens, the local clergy may be called to offer prayers and comfort. Faith and medicine intertwine here, neither fully replacing the other. A small wooden cross rests near the bedside. A whispered blessing fills the space. You remember stories of smallpox outbreaks that scarred survivors for life. Some communities have begun experimenting with inoculation, a risky procedure that introduces material from a mild case in hopes of preventing severe infection later. The practice is controversial. Some embrace it cautiously, others fear it as dangerous interference. Letters from the period reveal heated debate over its safety and morality. By midday, the fever either begins to recede or burns hotter. Time stretches painfully. You wipe sweat from flushed skin. You offer sips of water carefully measured. Your own exhaustion grows, yet adrenaline holds you upright. In households where multiple members fall ill, the atmosphere shifts dramatically. Work pauses, meals grow simpler. Anxiety thickens the air. Yet life continues beyond the walls. The market still opens, the bell still tolls. You glance toward the door, aware of how fragile your sense of stability truly is. Yesterday the child laughed at the market. Today they struggle for breath. Endurance here includes emotional resilience in the face of such abrupt change. There are recoveries that feel like miracles. Fever breaks in the night, leaving Sin cool and pale but alive. Strength returns gradually. You exhale deeply for the first time in days. There are also losses. Funerals are frequent enough that mourning customs are well established. Black garments appear, bells toll in slower rhythm, communities gather offering quiet comfort. Medical practitioners of the era record case histories with careful observation, noting symptoms and outcomes. Though lacking modern tools, many strive earnestly to understand patterns of illness. Their efforts lay groundwork for future breakthroughs. As evening approaches, you remain beside the sickbed listening. Each steady breath feels like a small victory. The room smells faintly of vinegar and smoke. Outside wind brushes against the walls. You realize that enduring daily life in this century means living with the constant possibility of illness. It is not a distant threat, but an intimate companion. You learn to respond quickly, to rely on neighbors, to balance hope with acceptance. When at last you lie down again, you do so lightly, ready to rise at the smallest sound. The fire glows faintly. The air feels fragile yet calm. And in this quiet vigil, you understand that resilience here is measured not only by physical strength, but by the tenderness with which you tend the vulnerable. By the patience of sitting through long nights. By the courage to greet dawn uncertain of what it will bring. The cough softens. The child sleeps more peacefully. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the gentle rhythm of breathing in the dark, grateful for each unremarkable inhale that signals another day endured. The memory of that fever lingers in your mind even after the worst has passed, because illness in this century rarely feels like a single event. It feels like a shadow that stretches across entire communities. You sense it in the way neighbours lower their voices when certain names are mentioned. You hear it in the slight pause before someone says the word pox. There are seasons when sickness moves not quietly from bed to bed, but loudly through streets and fields. Doors close, windows shutter. The usual hum of the market softens into something strained and watchful. One firmly established historical fact is that smallpox remained one of the most feared diseases across 18th century Europe. It disfigured survivors and claimed countless lives, cutting across social boundaries. Even royalty were not immune. The threat is democratic in its cruelty. You walk through the village and notice a small mark painted on a door signalling that a household inside is afflicted. It is not universal practice everywhere, but in some places such signs serve as warning. You hesitate before passing too close. Fear mixes with compassion. Church bells toll more frequently during outbreaks. Their sound carries differently, now heavier somehow. Funerals become more common. Graves fill in steady succession. The earth seems to accept bodies without surprise. There is an unusual detail from city records that describes watchmen appointed during epidemics to enforce quarantine measures. Streets are patrolled. Movement is restricted. Such controls are imperfect and often resented, yet they represent early attempts to contain contagion. You imagine the tension of being told you cannot leave your home while supplies dwindle. Medical responses vary widely. Some physicians advocate inoculation against smallpox, a practice slowly gaining ground despite controversy. Others remain skeptical or fearful of unintended consequences. Public debate unfolds in pamphlets and private letters alike. Researchers continue to explore how acceptance of inoculation spread unevenly, shaped by class geography and trust in authority. In rural areas, folk remedies resurface with renewed urgency. Herbal infusions, charms, whispered prayers. You may find yourself tying a small pouch of dried herbs near a child's bed, half believing, half hoping. The smell of illness lingers in confined spaces, vinegar sprinkled on floors, fires kept burning to cleanse the air, windows open despite cold weather. You feel the chill on your face as you stand beside an open shutter, inhaling deeply as though fresh air alone could repel danger. Markets thin out during severe outbreaks. Stalls stand half empty. Those who must trade do so quickly, eyes wary. Physical distance becomes an instinct rather than a rule written on paper. Historians still debate how communities balanced fear with economic necessity. Closing trade entirely could mean starvation. Continuing it risked further spread. You sense the impossible calculation in every decision. Inside homes, families rearrange themselves. The sick are isolated if space allows, though space is often scarce. Bedding is shifted. Children are sent to relatives in unaffected areas when possible. Separation aches, yet protection demands it. You recall stories of entire villages struck hard, their fields left untended, as too many fall ill at once. Crops wither not from weather, but from absence of hands. Illness and hunger intertwine in grim cycles, and yet not every outbreak devastates equally. Some pass swiftly, sparing most, others linger. You live in a state of guarded vigilance. A poignant note preserved in personal correspondence from the era reveals how people sometimes interpreted epidemics through moral or spiritual lenses, seeing them as tests or judgments. This belief shapes response. Some gather more fervently in prayer, others withdraw in quiet reflection. As days pass and the immediate threat recedes, life resumes gradually. Markets reopen fully. Children return to play. The bell tolls less often, but memory remains. You walk past a house where shutters stay closed longer than others. Loss leaves visible traces, a garden untended, a door that no longer opens at dawn. Grief becomes another layer of endurance. There is resilience too. Survivors of smallpox marked by scars carry visible reminders of what they have endured. In some cases, these marks confer a strange reassurance. Having survived once, they are less likely to fear reinfection. You sit by your own hearth in the evening and listen to the steady breathing of those around you. Each breath feels like quiet defiance against forces beyond your control. Epidemics teach harsh lessons about fragility. They also reveal networks of care. Neighbours who deliver food to quarantined homes. Midwives who tend the sick despite personal risk. Clergy who move from bedside to bedside offering comfort. Scholarly discussion continues about how repeated exposure to disease shaped cultural attitudes toward death and resilience. Did familiarity dull fear, or did it deepen communal bonds? Perhaps both. As night settles once more, you recognise that enduring daily life in this century includes living with collective memory of sickness. It shapes how you greet strangers, how you value health, how you interpret minor symptoms. The wind brushes softly against the walls. The fire burns low. Outside the village lies quiet beneath a sky indifferent to human suffering. You close your eyes, aware that while you cannot banish disease entirely, you can tend your hearth, your family, your small circle of care. And in that tending, you participate in a resilience that stretches beyond any single outbreak, carrying you and your community forward into another uncertain dawn. When illness loosens its grip and ordinary rhythms return, you begin to notice more sharply the contrast between where you live and where others do. The shape of endurance shifts depending on whether your feet tread mud or cobblestone. You imagine yourself stepping from a narrow urban doorway into a street that seems perpetually damp. In many 18th century cities, paving exists but is uneven. After rainwater gathers in shallow pools reflecting crooked rooflines, horses pass, hooves striking stone with sharp rhythm. Carts rattle loudly, iron rims grinding against cobbles. The air carries a complicated mixture of smells. Baking bread from one corner, tannery fumes from another, the less pleasant odours of waste that drains imperfectly along open gutters. A firmly grounded historical reality is that European cities expanded significantly during this century, often faster than infrastructure could keep pace. London, Paris, Amsterdam, Vienna all grew in population, drawing migrants from rural regions seeking opportunity. Housing pressed upward and inward, creating dense neighbourhoods where sunlight struggled to reach ground floors. You step carefully to avoid the worst of the mud. Laundry hangs overhead from window to window, like faded banners. Voices echo between buildings. A vendor calls out fresh fish. A bell clangs somewhere nearby. You feel surrounded by motion, by proximity, by constant awareness of other lives unfolding just beyond thin walls. From porcelain cups. If you walk a little from porcelain cups. If you walk a little farther, you might glimpse a grander avenue lined with townhouses whose facades boast symmetry and ornamentation. Social divisions are visible in stone and brick. In contrast, you picture yourself in the countryside, where space opens generously around you. Fields stretch outward in patchwork patterns. Hedges divide land carefully. Dirt paths wind between cottages, often turning slick after heavy rain. The soundscape shifts dramatically. Instead of clattering wheels and shouting vendors, you hear wind moving through grain birds calling from treetops the distant lowing of cattle. In rural life, isolation can be both blessing and burden. Fresh air feels abundant. Stars at night blaze more brightly without urban smoke. Yet distance from markets, physicians, and larger networks of support can leave you vulnerable. If your harvest fails, neighbours may share what they can, but supplies are finite. There is a curious detail noted in travel diaries of the era, describing how visitors from cities often romanticize the countryside, praising its tranquility, while overlooking the physical toll exacted by agricultural labour. Meanwhile, some rural dwellers viewed cities with equal parts fascination and suspicion, wary of moral corruption and crowding. Perception shifts depending on where you stand. Researchers continue to explore how mobility between town and country shaped identity. Seasonal migration for work was not uncommon. You might spend part of the year labouring in fields, then travel to a city for winter employment. Such movement blurs the line between urban and rural experience. In cities, nightfall transforms streets into spaces of heightened caution. Without widespread street lighting, darkness gathers quickly. Oil lamps hang at intervals in certain districts, but many lanes remain dim. You move carefully aware of uneven ground and unseen figures. Urban anonymity can offer freedom, but also risk. In villages, darkness settles more gently. The absence of artificial light creates profound quiet. You step outside after supper and see the sky stretch vast and uninterrupted. The Milky Way arches overhead, luminous and steady. There is comfort in such expansiveness. Economic opportunity differs as well. In cities, guild membership or commercial success might allow modest social advancement. In villages, land ownership or inheritance shapes status more rigidly. Historians still discuss the degree to which 18th century Europe allowed meaningful social mobility across these environments. Evidence suggests limited but real openings, often constrained by birth and connections. You consider sanitation once more. Urban waste accumulates more visibly. Efforts to regulate disposal exist but are unevenly enforced. In rural areas, waste returns more directly to fields as fertilizer, closing a practical loop. Each environment carries its own hazards. There is also variation in entertainment. Cities host theatres, public lectures, and larger fairs. Villages rely on seasonal festivals and communal gatherings. Both offer relief from routine, though scale differs. As you walk along a country path at dusk, you feel the soft give of earth beneath your shoes. Crickets begin their evening chorus. Smoke rises from scattered chimneys. The horizon glows faintly before surrendering to night. If instead you stroll through a city square, lantern light flickers against stone facades. Laughter spills from a tavern. A carriage rolls past, wheels splashing through shallow puddles. Endurance in each setting demands different adjustments. In cities, you learn to navigate crowds, noise, and competition. In villages, you adapt to isolation, weather extremes, and dependence on soil. Yet both share common threads. Work defines your days, community shapes your identity. Faith anchors uncertainty, illness lurks unpredictably. You pause at the edge of a field or at the corner of a bustling street and realize that 18th century Europe is not a single uniform experience. It is a mosaic of environments, each requiring its own form of resilience. As night deepens, you return home wherever that may be. Timber walls or brick facades, open fields or narrow lanes. Inside the hearth glows familiar and steady. And you understand that whether surrounded by clattering carts or whispering grasses, you endure by adapting to the rhythms of place. The land beneath your feet, the streets you tread, the walls that shelter you all shape the way you rise, work and rest. In that constant negotiation between environment and effort, daily life unfolds quietly persistent beneath an ever-changing sky. As you grow accustomed to the sounds of your village or city, another presence hums quietly beneath daily routine. Authority. It waits in courthouses, in manor halls, in the stern gaze of officials who carry the weight of law in their posture. You may not think about it constantly, yet it shapes your choices, how loudly you argue, where you walk after dark, whether you dare to stretch truth in the marketplace. In many parts of 18th century Europe, justice is visible and public. A well-established historical reality is that punishments often unfolded before gathered crowds designed not only to correct the offender, but to instruct the community. Stocks, pillories, whipping posts stand in central squares. They are not hidden away. You step into the marketplace on a day when something unusual has drawn a larger crowd. A man stands with his head and hands locked in wooden stocks. Children whisper and point. Adults shake their heads. His crime may be theft, drunkenness, or unpaid debts. The details matter less than the message. Order must be maintained. There is a striking anecdote recorded in town archives describing how crowds sometimes treated these punishments with a mix of ridicule and sympathy. Rotten vegetables might be thrown. At other times, friends quietly offer water or words of comfort. Public shame becomes a complicated performance. You feel the tension in the air. Justice here is not abstract. It has texture. The creak of wood, the murmur of onlookers, the smell of damp earth beneath your feet. Serious crimes draw harsher consequences. In some regions, executions remain public spectacles. Though you might avert your eyes, attendance is often expected. The event serves as both warning and grim reminder of the state's power. Researchers continue to examine whether such displays genuinely deterred crime or instead normalized violence within society. The answer remains layered. Records show fluctuations in crime rates, but motivations are complex. Local courts handle smaller disputes. Property boundaries, broken contracts, accusations of slander. You might find yourself summoned to testify in a quarrel between neighbours over a wandering pig or an unpaid loan. The courtroom is modest, perhaps a single chamber with a raised seat for the magistrate. Proceedings are formal yet familiar. Legal systems vary widely across Europe during this century. Some regions operate under customary law shaped by local tradition. Others follow centralized codes influenced by the monarchs or emerging Enlightenment thought. You may not know the philosophical debates unfolding in distant capitals, but you feel their impact when new regulations alter taxes or trade practices. There is also the quiet presence of informal justice. Community reputation carries immense weight. Gossip can wound nearly as deeply as legal sanction. A family known for dishonesty may find doors closing to them in subtle ways. An unusual detail preserved in court documents involves the prosecution of witchcraft accusations still lingering in certain areas, though far less common than in previous centuries. Fear and superstition occasionally flare into formal charges, revealing how belief and law intersect unpredictably. You consider the role of authority in your own life. Perhaps you owe rent to a landlord who holds significant power over your housing. Perhaps you are subject to conscription if war breaks out. Perhaps taxes consume more of your income than feels fair. Scholars continue to explore how ordinary people navigated these systems, sometimes resisting quietly through evasion or collective protest. Bread riots, tax revolts, and petitions appear in historical records as evidence that obedience was not absolute. As dusk settles, you walk past the now empty stocks in the square. The wood stands silent, a reminder of the day's lesson. You feel a mixture of caution and resignation. Law can protect as well as punish. It may settle disputes peacefully that might otherwise escalate. In your own home, authority takes gentler forms. Parents enforce rules, masters direct apprentices, social hierarchies guide interactions. These layers of control overlap, creating a web that both stabilizes and constrains. You sit near the hearth and reflect on how enduring daily life in this century requires constant awareness of boundaries. Some are written into law, others exist only in custom. You learn when to speak and when to remain silent, when to challenge and when to comply. These decisions are rarely dramatic. They unfold in small daily calculations. Outside the square grows quiet. The place of punishment becomes once more an ordinary meeting spot. Children run past it without fear. Merchants set up stalls nearby as if nothing has happened. And perhaps that is the most telling detail of all. Justice here is woven into the fabric of life so tightly that even its harshest expressions become part of the background. You lie down that night aware that safety and vulnerability exists side by side. The same system that punishes wrongdoing may protect your property or defend your town. Authority feels both heavy and necessary. The fire dims, shadows stretch along the walls. Somewhere in the distance a watchman calls out the hour, his voice steady in the dark. You close your eyes knowing that tomorrow, like today, will unfold within these visible and invisible lines of order. And you will navigate them carefully as generations before you have done, balancing caution with courage as you continue to endure. Morning light returns softly, and with it you become more aware of something that has been present all along but rarely named outright. The quiet, constant labour carried by women. It threads through every scene you have witnessed, sometimes visible, often overlooked, always essential. You rise and notice how tasks already begin before full daylight. A woman stirs the embers back to life, her movements practiced and efficient. She measures grain for porridge, checks the water bucket, sets aside scraps of cloth for mending. In many 18th century households, women's work extends far beyond cooking and cleaning. It forms the backbone of domestic economy. A widely recognized historical pattern shows that women contributed substantially to agricultural production as well as household industry. In rural communities, they plant weed harvest, milk cows, tend poultry, and preserve food. Their hands move constantly, rarely idle. You watch as sleeves are rolled up, skirts tucked carefully to allow freer movement. In towns, women often participate in small-scale trade. They sell produce in markets, manage stalls, brew ale, or assist in family workshops. Widows sometimes continue their husbands' businesses, navigating guild regulations that can either restrict or permit their activity depending on local custom. There is a telling detail preserved in probate inventories revealing how spinning wheels appear in countless households, tangible proof of women's involvement in textile production. The steady hum of spinning becomes part of the soundscape of daily life. You sit nearby and listen as fibers twist into thread rhythm, steady and patient. Marriage reshapes responsibilities but does not reduce them. A wife may manage household accounts, supervise servants if the family is prosperous, or stretch limited resources if they are not. She balances food stores, calculates how long flour must last, decides when to slaughter a chicken, or save it for eggs. These decisions require foresight and skill. Researchers continue to explore how women negotiated authority within patriarchal legal systems. While formal power often rests with husbands or male relatives, practical influence within the home can be significant. Letters and diaries reveal women advising spouses on financial matters, mediating disputes and shaping family strategy. Childbearing marks another layer of endurance. Pregnancy arrives without modern medical support. Midwives play crucial roles, carrying knowledge passed through generations. You imagine the dim room where labour unfolds, women gathered close offering whispered encouragement. Survival rates have improved compared to earlier centuries, yet childbirth remains dangerous. An intriguing anecdote from rural folklore tells of women placing protective charms near birthing beds to ward off unseen threats. Such practices blend belief and practicality, reflecting the desire for control in moments of vulnerability. Clothing itself becomes evidence of labour. Aprons stained from repeated use, hands roughened from scrubbing floors and hauling water. You notice the quiet pride in well-maintained linen, the satisfaction of a neatly patched garment. Education for women varies widely by region and class. In certain urban centres, daughters of merchants may learn reading and writing alongside basic arithmetic. In poorer families, instruction often focuses on practical skills. Scholars still discuss how literacy rates among women rose unevenly during this period, influenced by religious movements that encouraged personal Bible reading. You step into a kitchen and observe bread being kneaded with firm, deliberate pressure. Dough yields beneath capable palms. The scent of yeast fills the air. This daily act feeds the household and sometimes generates income through sales. There are moments of respite too. Neighbours gather to assist with large tasks such as laundry or preserving fruit. Work becomes social. Stories are exchanged, laughter shared. Solidarity grows from shared effort. Yet constraints remain visible. Legal identity in many regions remains tied to marital status. Property rights are limited. Public office is rarely accessible. You sense both strength and restriction coexisting within the same space. A curious detail from court cases reveals instances of women petitioning local authorities for relief from abusive situations or financial hardship. While outcomes vary, such petitions demonstrate agency within constraints. As evening settles, you watch a woman sit by the hearth repairing a torn sleeve by candlelight. The needle moves steadily despite fatigue. Each stitch represents care and continuity. There is ongoing academic conversation about whether 18th century Europe witnessed subtle shifts in gender roles as economic and intellectual changes gathered momentum. Some argue that Enlightenment ideas began to challenge traditional assumptions, at least among elites. Others contend that everyday realities changed more slowly. You consider how endurance here often carries a distinctly female dimension. It includes not only physical labour but emotional stewardship, comforting children, mediating tensions, preserving small joys amid scarcity. The fire glows warmly against the walls. Outside wind brushes softly against shutters. Inside work continues even as night deepens. You lie down aware that much of daily survival depends on these steady, often uncelebrated efforts. The bread you eat, the clothes you wear, the order within your home all bear the imprint of women's hands. And in recognizing this, you understand that enduring life in this century is never a solitary achievement. It is a collective endeavour shaped profoundly by those whose labour hums quietly beneath the surface, sustaining families and communities through every shifting season. As you drift from the warmth of the hearth into another morning, your attention shifts toward those who live and labour within households not their own. Servants, apprentices, hired hands. Their presence is woven so tightly into 18th century society that sad it can almost fade into the background, yet their daily endurance carries its own particular weight. You imagine yourself rising not in the bed of your childhood home, but on a narrow pallet tucked beneath a staircase or in a corner of the kitchen. The house around you may be grander than most, its ceilings higher, its floors better polished. Yet your place within it is clearly defined. A well-documented social reality is that domestic service employed a significant portion of young adults in early modern Europe, especially in towns and cities. For many, working as a servant was a common life stage before marriage. You enter service in your teens, leaving your family to earn wages, gain skills, and perhaps build connections that will support your future. The day begins earlier for you than for those you serve. Fires must be lit before the household wakes, floors swept, water carried upstairs for washing. You move quietly through corridors, careful not to disturb. In wealthier homes, hierarchy among servants mirrors the hierarchy above. A housekeeper oversees maids, a butler manages footmen. Cooks command kitchens with authority sharpened by experience. You learn quickly where you stand in this internal order. There is a fascinating detail preserved in letters between employers that reveals how references and reputation determine a servant's prospects. A single unfavourable comment can limit opportunities. You guard your conduct carefully. Wages vary by region and role. Payment may include room and board, modest coin, and sometimes clothing. Though not luxurious, service can offer stability compared to precarious rural labour. Yet it also demands obedience. Researchers continue to examine how servants negotiated autonomy within structured households. Some formed close bonds with employers almost familial in tone. Others endured harsh discipline or exploitation. Experiences differ widely. You picture yourself polishing silver until it gleams like still water. The metal reflects your face faintly distorted. The scent of beeswax polish lingers in the air. Upstairs, the family prepares for breakfast. Your presence is essential yet discreet. Apprenticeship follows a related path. Bound by contract to a master craftsman, you live under his roof and submit to his authority. In exchange, you receive training in a trade that may define your livelihood for decades. The arrangement is practical and often strict. There is a curious anecdote from guild records describing apprentices staging small acts of rebellion, sneaking out after curfew or shirking minor duties. Youthful defiance flickers even within structured systems. In rural estates, hired labourers rise before dawn to tend fields owned by others. Their work resembles that of independent farmers, but without the same claim to land. Rent and obligation shape every decision. Class distinctions remain visible in clothing and speech. You address employers with formal titles. You step aside when they pass, yet proximity breeds familiarity. You overhear family arguments, witness private sorrows. Boundaries blur subtly over time. Historians still discuss the degree to which service functioned as a ladder of mobility. Some individuals saved wages and later established their own households or businesses. Others remained in service for life, their aspirations constrained by circumstance. Evenings bring limited respite. You may sit briefly in the kitchen sharing simple food with fellow servants. Conversation flows quietly, stories of past employers, dreams of future independence, laughter that carries relief. There are risks too. Young women in service face vulnerability to unwanted attention. Court records contain cases of disputes and accusations that reveal the precarious balance of power within households. Despite these challenges, service also offers exposure to wider ideas and customs. In urban centres, servants may hear discussions of politics or philosophy that rarely reach isolated villages. Knowledge circulates in unexpected ways. You step outside briefly after a long day and breathe in cool evening air. The sky above the grand house is the same sky above humble cottages. For a moment, social rank feels less absolute. Inside, the family settles into comfortable chambers. You return to your small space, rolling out bedding near the kitchen hearth where warmth lingers longest. Fatigue settles heavily into your limbs. Endurance here requires attentiveness not only to physical tasks but to unspoken expectations. You anticipate needs before they are voiced. You navigate personalities carefully. You balance ambition with discretion. As sleep approaches, you reflect on how many lives intersect within these walls. Masters and servants, apprentices and artisans, each role distinct yet interconnected. The fire dims gradually. Shadows stretch across polished floors and rough kitchen tiles alike. You close your eyes knowing that tomorrow will begin again before dawn with the quiet clatter of kindling and the steady rhythm of labour performed in someone else's name. And through it all, You will endure carving dignity from routine shaping your future within the boundaries of service that define this chapter of your life. The air changes before you even open your eyes. You sense it in the weight pressing against the walls, in the faint bite that touches your nose, or the heavy warmth that clings to your skin. Seasons rule your endurance more firmly than any clock or calendar. In winter morning arrives reluctantly. You wake in darkness, breath visible in pale clouds above your blanket. The fire you banked the night before has dwindled to faint embers. You slip from bedding and hurry to coax flame back to life, fingers stiff with cold. A commonly acknowledged reality of 18th century Europe is that most households relied on fireplaces or simple stoves for heat, and these rarely warmed every corner evenly. If your bed stands near an outer wall, frost may trace delicate patterns along the interior. You pull on extra layers, wool upon wool, perhaps a knitted cap worn even indoors. Movement becomes your ally against chill. Work does not pause for weather. Animals must still be fed. Water drawn from wells sometimes freezes at the surface, forcing you to break thin ice before lowering the bucket. There is a small but vivid note found in personal diaries describing how families sometimes placed heated stones wrapped in cloth at the foot of the beds to preserve warmth through the night. You can almost feel the gentle radiance against your cold toes, a humble comfort. Winter also reshapes diet. Root vegetables dominate. Preserved meats and salted fish provide protein. Fresh produce is scarce. The landscape outside appears muted fields resting beneath frost or snow. Sound carries differently in cold air, sharper and clearer. Yet winter brings certain advantages. In rural communities, agricultural labour lessens slightly after harvest. Evenings stretch longer. You gather near the hearth for storytelling, mending and quiet conversation. Candlelight flickers softly against dark beams. Researchers continue to explore how people experienced winter psychologically. Did the extended darkness weigh heavily on spirits, or did communal gatherings counterbalance isolation? Evidence suggests both experiences existed side by side. Then spring arrives cautiously. Mud replaces frost. Fields soften under new growth. You step carefully along paths slick with thaw. Lambs appear in pastures, their bleats bright and hopeful. Work intensifies once more as planting begins. Hope mingles with anxiety. A late frost could undo fragile progress. Summer transforms endurance again. Heat settles thickly in low valleys and crowded city streets. Wool feels heavier against your skin. Sweat gathers along your back. Windows open wide in search of breeze. In some regions, insects multiply in humid air, their constant buzzing a minor but relentless irritation. A documented agricultural truth of the era is that harvest time demands extraordinary effort. You rise before dawn and labour until light fades, cutting grain, bundling sheaves, hauling loads to storage. The scent of ripe wheat fills your senses. Dust clings to hair and clothing. Muscles ache deeply, yet urgency drives you forward. Crops must be gathered before storms threaten. There is an unusual custom recorded in certain rural traditions where communities celebrated the completion of harvest with small feasts or dances. These moments offer relief, gratitude woven into song and shared food. Autumn follows with cooler air and golden light. Leaves turn slowly, fields empty of standing crops. You preserve what you can for winter. Apples stored in cellars, cabbages fermented, wood chopped and stacked carefully beside walls. Scholars still debate how vulnerable communities truly were to climatic fluctuations during this period, especially in the context of the lingering effects of the Little Ice Age. Weather patterns influenced yields significantly. A single harsh season could tip households into hardship. You step outside one evening in late autumn and notice the crisp scent of fallen leaves. Smoke from chimneys curls upward against a deepening sky. The year turns quietly. Clothing shifts with the seasons. Linen replaces heavier layers in summer. Cloaks return in winter. Bedding thickens or thins accordingly. Even sleeping arrangements adjust. In hot weather, you may choose to rest nearer an open window despite the risk of drafts. In cold months, everyone crowds closer to the hearth. Seasonal illness patterns emerge as well. Colds cluster in winter. Digestive complaints rise during warmer months when food spoils more quickly. You learn to read subtle changes in the air as warnings. Markets reflect the cycle too. Fresh berries in summer, root vegetables in winter. Prices fluctuate with abundance and scarcity. Your household calculations adapt accordingly. As another year advances, you realize how deeply your endurance is tied to these natural rhythms. You cannot command frost to retreat or rain to fall, you respond instead. You prepare, adjust, endure. Standing at the edge of a field in late afternoon, you watch clouds drift slowly across a pale sky. Wind brushes against your face, cool but gentle. Somewhere nearby a dog barks lazily. In this century, time is not measured only in hours but in seasons. Your body learns to anticipate change. Your household stores reflect foresight or miscalculation. Your mood shifts subtly with light and temperature. Night falls earlier now. You return indoors, stacking another log upon the fire. Sparks leap briefly before settling, and as you curl beneath blankets once more, you understand that enduring daily life here means living in partnership with the turning year. Winter tests you, summer exhausts you, spring tempts you with hope, autumn demands preparation. Through each cycle you adapt quietly, adjusting clothing, labor, diet, and expectation. The seasons move forward regardless of your readiness, and you, resilient and persistent, move with them, one turning after another, beneath an ever-patient sky. After long weeks shaped by frost or harvest heat, you begin to recognize how precious even the smallest moments of leisure can feel. They do not arrive often, and when they do, they slip in quietly between obligations like sunlight breaking briefly through heavy cloud. You finish your day's work and sense a subtle shift in the air. It might be a feast day marked on the church calendar, or simply an evening when labour ends a little earlier than usual. You wash your hands, smooth your hair, and step toward the sound of distant laughter. In many 18th century communities, communal celebrations punctuate the year. Religious festivals, harvest gatherings, weddings, and fairs create space for joy amid routine. A well-established historical observation is that despite long working hours, people in this era participated regularly in collective festivities tied to the agricultural and liturgical calendar. These events offered sanctioned relief from the demands of survival. You arrive at a village green or town square where lanterns flicker softly as the dusk settles. A fiddler tunes his instrument. The first notes rise into the cooling air, light and quick. Someone claps in rhythm. Children dart between adults' cheeks, flushed with excitement. Food appears in greater abundance than usual. Pies filled with spiced fruit. Roasted meats turning slowly over open flames. Ale poured generously into simple cups. The scent is rich, comforting. You take a sip and feel warmth spread through your chest. There is a charming detail preserved in accounts of rural fairs describing contests of strength and skill, tugging ropes, lifting heavy stones, racing across uneven ground. These displays are not merely entertainment. They reinforce community identity and pride. In towns, taverns serve as regular gathering places even outside festival days. You push open a wooden door and step into a room alive with conversation. Candles cast golden pools of light across rough tables. Smoke curls lazily towards the ceiling. Someone recounts a humorous story from the market. Laughter erupts full and unguarded. Researchers continue to explore how taverns functioned as social and political spaces. Beyond drinking, they hosted discussions of local issues, trade matters, and occasionally broader ideas circulating through pamphlets. Leisure and debate intertwine. Games unfold on tabletops. Cards shuffle deftly, dice clatter against wood. Wagers are modest, yet tension sharpens each throw. You lean closer, eyes reflecting candlelight. Music fills corners of the room. A song begins, voices joining gradually until melody swells strong and steady. Lyrics often tell familiar tales of love loss and everyday humour. You find yourself singing along, even if slightly off-key. There are quieter pleasures too. In a cottage by the hearth, you might listen as an elder tells stories from earlier decades. Tales of harsh winters survived, of markets long past. Oral tradition preserves memory in the absence of printed records. In urban centres, theatres attract those who can afford admission. Performances range from comedic plays to dramatic tragedies. The stage glows beneath candlelight, actors projecting their voices to packed audiences. Applause echoes against ornate balconies. Though tickets cost coin, even modest earners sometimes save for the experience. A curious anecdote from travel diaries recounts how street performers in cities captivated crowds with acrobatics, trained animals, or illusion tricks. Entertainment exists not only in formal venues but in public squares where anyone may pause to watch. Scholars still debate the extent to which leisure provided genuine psychological relief versus reinforcing existing hierarchies. Festivals often mirror social rank in seating and participation. Yet for a few hours, barriers soften. Music and laughter blur distinctions. You notice how fatigue recedes temporarily when joy enters the room. Muscles relax, shoulders drop, worries about grain prices or illness fade into background hum. As night deepens, lanterns flicker lower. Children grow sleepy, leaning against parents' knees. Conversations slow, someone yawns openly. The fiddler plays one last tune softer now. You step back into cool night air, cheeks flushed from warmth inside, stars shimmer overhead. The village or city seems gentler somehow, as if shared laughter has smoothed its sharper edges. Leisure here is not constant or extravagant. It is carved carefully from the margins of duty. Its rarity heightens its sweetness. Back at home, you bank the fire and lie down with a faint smile lingering. The memory of music hums quietly in your mind. Tomorrow work will resume its steady cadence. Fields will demand attention. Markets will bustle again. But tonight you carry with you the reminder that endurance includes joy. That even within narrow walls and long hours, people found ways to gather, sing, compete, and celebrate. As sleep approaches, you realize that these modest pleasures are not frivolous. They strengthen bonds. They renew spirit. They make the repetition of daily life bearable. The last echoes of laughter fade into silence. The night settles gently around you. And in that calm, you understand that to endure this century is not only to labor and survive, but also to cherish the flickers of light that appear between obligations, warming you just enough to greet the next dawn with steady resolve. The morning after laughter feels slightly softer, as if the echo of song still lingers faintly in the air. Yet alongside music and markets, another current flows steadily through your world. News, information, gossip carried by voice, ink, and rumor alike. You step into the square and notice a small cluster gathered around a man holding a folded sheet of paper. He clears his throat and begins to read aloud. Not everyone can decipher the printed words themselves, but many can listen. The crowd leans in. A firmly established historical development of the 18th century is the expansion of print culture. Newspapers, pamphlets, broadsides, and cheap booklets circulate more widely than in previous generations, especially in urban centres. Printing presses hum quietly behind shopfronts, producing pages that travel beyond their place of origin. You hear snippets about distant wars, trade agreements, royal decrees. The names of far-off cities sound almost exotic as they roll through the air. For a moment, your village feels connected to a much larger world. There is a small but striking detail preserved in accounts of rural communities describing how a single newspaper might be read repeatedly over weeks, passed from hand to hand until its edges frayed. Information stretches thin but travels far. In towns, coffee houses emerge as hubs of conversation. You step through a doorway and smell roasted beans mingling with ink and damp wool. Cups clink softly against saucers. Men lean over tables debating politics with animated gestures. Some establishments even post newspapers on walls for shared reading. Researchers continue to examine how these spaces contributed to what later thinkers would call a public sphere, a place where ideas could be exchanged outside formal authority. Not everyone is welcome equally. Women's access varies by region and custom. Yet discussion grows livelier. You return home carrying fragments of what you have heard. News transforms as it moves. A whispered detail becomes exaggerated by the time it reaches your neighbour's ear. Gossip fills gaps left by incomplete information. An intriguing anecdote from urban police records describes officials attempting to track the spread of false rumours during moments of political tension. Word of mouth proves difficult to contain. Stories move faster than horses. Even in places where literacy remains limited, handwritten letters serve as lifelines. A son writes from the city to his rural parents describing opportunity or hardship. The letter is read aloud multiple times, each sentence savoured. Ink connects distances that would otherwise feel insurmountable. Books, though, costly, circulate among wealthier households and institutions. Philosophical treatises, scientific observations, novels that transport readers beyond their immediate surroundings. You might not own such volumes, but you sense their presence shaping conversations. Scholars still debate how deeply Enlightenment ideas penetrated everyday rural life versus remaining concentrated among urban elites. Evidence suggests a spectrum. Some farmers may never encounter complex political theory directly. Others absorb simplified versions through sermons, pamphlets, or tavern debates. You overhear talk of reforms proposed by monarchs in distant capitals, tax changes, military campaigns, grain regulations. Decisions made far away ripple outward, altering your daily calculations. There is also the steady flow of practical information, market prices, weather forecasts based on local observation, warnings about bandits on the certain roads. Knowledge shared quickly can mean the difference between profit and loss, safety and danger. You pause near a small stall selling inexpensive pamphlets printed with sensational tales. Stories of crime, miraculous events, or scandal draw eager buyers. Entertainment and information blend seamlessly. At home, conversation at supper includes not only family matters, but fragments of broader news. You repeat what you heard in the square. Someone questions its accuracy. Another offers a different version heard from a traveller passing through. Travellers themselves serve as carriers of stories. Merchants arriving with goods bring tales from ports and capitals. Soldiers on leave recount experiences from distant battlefields. Their words paint vivid images in your imagination. A curious detail from diaries of the period reveals how some individuals kept personal journals recording both local happenings and international developments, weaving them together into a narrative of their time. Even without formal education, people often possessed keen awareness of events shaping their world. You consider how information changes your sense of place. Knowing that revolutions stir elsewhere or that scientific discoveries challenge old beliefs subtly alters how you interpret your own circumstances. Yet news can also unsettle. Rumours of rising taxes provoke anxiety. Reports of crop failures in neighbouring provinces raise fear of scarcity. As evening falls, you sit by the hearth and reflect on how endurance in this century involves not only physical resilience, but mental adaptation to shifting information. You learn to weigh sources, to balance rumour against observation, to maintain calm amid uncertainty. The candle flame flickers beside a folded pamphlet resting on the sill. Its inked letters represent ideas that travel beyond borders and generations. You lie down with thoughts drifting between your own modest concerns and the wider currents shaping Europe. In the quiet darkness, the world feels both vast and intimately connected, and as sleep draws near, you recognize that daily life here is not confined to the walls around you. It is linked by words carried on paper and breath, binding villages to cities, fields to courts, ordinary households to grand debates unfolding far beyond your doorstep. The news you heard in the square lingers in your thoughts, especially the stories carried by travellers. Distance in this century is not measured only in miles, but in endurance. To journey from one town to another demands preparation, patience, and a tolerance for discomfort that modern convenience has almost erased from memory. You imagine yourself standing at the edge of a road just after dawn. The surface beneath your feet is uneven, a mixture of packed earth and scattered stones. After rain, it becomes thick with mud that clings stubbornly to boots and wagon wheels alike. A widely recognised historical reality is that road conditions across much of 18th century Europe varied dramatically, with many routes remaining rough and poorly maintained outside major trade corridors. If you travel on foot, you carry what you can manage on your back. A small bundle of clothing, perhaps a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, each step requires effort. The rhythm of walking becomes steady and almost meditative. You learn to pace yourself, carefully aware that exhaustion invites misfortune. If fortune allows, you ride in a cart or carriage. The experience is hardly smooth. Wheels jolt against ruts, sending vibrations through wooden seats. You grip the edge tightly as the vehicle sways. Dust rises in dry weather, coating hair and eyelashes. In winter, cold wind cuts through layered garments despite your best efforts to wrap yourself securely. There is a curious detail preserved in travel journals describing how inns along busy routes often displayed signs painted with vivid animals or symbols serving as landmarks for the weary travellers who could not read. You approach one such inn at dusk, its lantern glowing warmly against gathering dark. Inside, the air smells of stew and damp wool. You share a table with strangers, each carrying their own destination and story. Conversation flows cautiously at first, then more freely as ale loosens tongues. In this space, social distinctions blur slightly. Merchant and farmer, soldier and artisan sit shoulder to shoulder. Researchers continue to examine how travel facilitated the exchange of ideas, goods and customs. Movement spreads fashion trends, dialect expressions, even political sentiments. A traveller returning home may bring new perspectives that subtly reshape local thinking. Danger remains an undercurrent. Banditry persists in certain regions, especially along isolated stretches of road. You keep a watchful eye on fellow passengers and avoid travelling alone when possible. Stories of robbery circulate widely, some exaggerated, others painfully true. River travel offers an alternative where geography permits. Barges glide along waterways carrying grain, timber and passengers. The pace is slower but steadier. You lean against the railing and watch banks drift past reeds swaying gently. Water reflects sky in soft ripples. Sea voyages extend distance further still. Ports bustle with activity. Masts rise like a forest of timber against the horizon. Salt air stings your nose. Ships carry not only goods but letters and news linking continents. A documented historical pattern shows that increased trade networks during this century gradually improved certain infrastructure projects, including canals and turnpike roads in some regions. Toll gates appear along improved routes, requiring payment for smoother passage. Progress arrives unevenly. As you continue your imagined journey, fatigue settles into your legs. The landscape shifts slowly. Fields give way to forests, then back to cultivated land. Villages appear at intervals, each with its own church spire marking the skyline. You reflect on how travel changes your sense of scale. A neighbouring town that feels distant may lie only a day's walk away. A capital city might require weeks to reach. Letters bridge some gaps, but physical presence still carries weight. There is scholarly discussion about how mobility affected social identity. Did frequent travel erode local loyalties or strengthen them? By contrast, evidence suggests that many people retained strong ties to birthplace even after extended absence. As evening approaches, you finally see the outline of your destination rising ahead. Relief mingles with anticipation. You brush dust from your coat and adjust your bundle. Upon arrival, you greet familiar faces or cautiously introduce yourself to strangers. Travel demands courage, but offers opportunity. Apprentices seek masters in new cities. Merchants expand trade networks. Pilgrims pursue spiritual fulfillment. When at last you lie down in an unfamiliar bed, perhaps sharing space with another traveller, you listen to the creak of floorboards and the murmur of distant voices. The journey hums in your muscles. Endurance here includes the willingness to move despite uncertainty. Roads may be rough, inns imperfect, yet the desire for connection, opportunity, or obligation draws you forward. As sleep overtakes you, you understand that 18th century Europe is not static. It pulses with movement. Carts rumble, ships sail, feet trade long miles of earth. And in that steady motion, communities intertwine, carrying good stories and resilience across landscapes that challenge and shape every traveller who dares to step beyond the comfort of familiar walls. The road you imagined walking does not exist in isolation from larger forces. Even if you remain in your village for years without travelling far, war can still find you. It arrives first as rumour carried by travellers, then as official notice read aloud in the square, and finally as the distant thunder of boots on earth. You stand among neighbours as a proclamation is announced. A conflict has erupted between kingdoms. Alliances are forming. Armies are mobilising. The words feel both distant and intimate at once. A widely acknowledged historical reality is that 18th century Europe was marked by frequent wars, from dynastic struggles to territorial disputes that reshaped borders with unsettling regularity. At first, daily life continues almost unchanged. Fields still require tending, markets still open, yet tension hums beneath ordinary tasks. You glance toward the road more often, listening for unusual sounds. Then one morning, soldiers pass through your town. Their uniforms add sharp colour to muted streets. Drums beat steady rhythms. Faces are young, some determined, others uncertain. You watch them march and wonder who among them will return. Conscription laws vary across regions, but many communities are required to provide men for service. If you are of age and health, your name might be drawn. Families gather quietly the night before departure, offering blessings and restrained tears. Researchers continues to examine how military service altered social mobility and identity. For some, it offered wages and a sense of purpose beyond village boundaries. For others, it meant separation and peril. There is a curious detail recorded in soldiers' letters describing how they carried small tokens from home into battle. A ribbon, a prayer card, a lock of hair. Such objects bridge the distance between hearth and battlefield. Even if you remain behind, war touches your household. Taxes rise to fund campaigns. Supplies are requisitioned. Grain stored carefully for winter may be demanded for troops. You measure out flour with increased caution, aware that shortages loom. If armies move nearby, fields can suffer. Trampling hooves flatten crops. Foraging soldiers take livestock. Fear spreads quickly. Some families hide valuables beneath floorboards or bury them discreetly in gardens. Historians still discuss the psychological impact of near-constant conflict during this century. Did communities become hardened to it as accepting war as inevitable, or did anxiety simmer persistently beneath routine? Evidence suggests a blend of resilience and quiet dread. In cities, news of victories or defeats sparks public reaction. Bells ring triumphantly after success. Faces fall solemnly after loss. Pamphlets circulate with patriotic fervour or biting criticism. You notice how conversation shifts at the market. Names of generals replace gossip about grain prices. Maps are sketched in dust, with sticks as men debate distant battles they have never witnessed. There is also the quieter toll of wounded soldiers returning home. Limps, missing limbs, eyes that seem older than their years. Communities absorb them back into daily life, adjusting tasks and expectations. Women often bear additional burdens during wartime, managing farms in absence of husbands, stretching resources further, offering support to other families facing similar strain. A documented historical pattern shows that some wars stimulated certain industries, such as textile production for uniforms or metalwork for weapons. Economic effects ripple unevenly, opportunity for a few, hardship for many. You sit by the hearth one evening and listen as someone reads aloud a letter from a relative serving far away. The ink speaks of cold camps, of longing for home, of camaraderie and fear. Silence follows the final sentence. Even when battles occur far beyond your region, peaceful political outcomes reshape laws and allegiances. Borders shift on maps, rulers change. You adapt once more, often with little direct influence over the decisions. There are moments of celebration when peace treaties are signed, church bells ring, markets fill with cautious optimism, yet memory of loss lingers. As night deepens, you step outside briefly and look toward the dark horizon. Somewhere beyond it, armies maneuver under the same stars. You feel small in the vastness of such events, yet undeniably connected. Endurance in this century includes learning to live with the possibility of upheaval, to continue planting and harvesting even when uncertainty hovers, to love and hope despite the risk of separation. You return indoors and sit quietly among family. The fire crackles softly, indifferent to politics and power. Tomorrow you will rise again. Fields will still require attention. Bread will still need baking. War may shape the backdrop of your life, but daily survival remains rooted in ordinary acts. And in that quiet persistence you discover a particular kind of strength. Not the dramatic courage of battlefield charge, but the steady resolve to maintain home and hearth while history surges unpredictably beyond your doorstep. When the echo of marching boots fades and soldiers move beyond your horizon, another quieter pressure settles back into focus. Obligation. Not the dramatic kind shouted in proclamations, but the steady, measured demand of coins and grain owed to those above you. You sit at the rough wooden table and spread out what little money you have earned. The metal pieces glint faintly in candlelight. You count them once. Then again. A significant and well-documented reality of 18th century Europe is that taxation formed a heavy burden for many ordinary people, particularly peasants and urban labourers. Monarchies funded courts, wars and administration through levies that trickled downward into villages and neighbourhoods like a persistent drizzle. If you farm land that is not entirely your own, you may owe rent to a landlord. This payment might take the form of coin produce or labour. On designated days, you work the Lord's fields before tending your own. The arrangement has deep historical roots, though by this century it varies widely depending on region and reform. You measure out sacks of grain carefully. Each handful surrendered feels like a small tightening in your chest. Yet you know that refusal carries consequences. In some areas, tithes add another layer of duty. A portion of harvest goes to support the local church and clergy. You may not resent it openly, especially if faith anchors your life, but the arithmetic remains inescapable. What you give away cannot feed your family. Researchers continue to explore how the distribution of tax burdens differed sharply between social classes. In certain kingdoms, nobles and clergy enjoyed exemptions that left commoners carrying disproportionate weight. Such imbalances simmer quietly, sometimes erupting into protest. There is a striking anecdote preserved in municipal archives describing villagers collectively petitioning authorities to reduce levies after successive poor harvests. Their language is respectful yet urgent, revealing both deference and desperation. Urban dwellers faced their own financial demands, guild fees, market tolls, charges for using certain roads or bridges. You feel the steady drip of obligation shaping every decision. Coins themselves vary in quality and value. You turn one between your fingers and wonder whether it will be accepted at full worth. Debasement of currency occasionally fuels mistrust. The stability of money is not always guaranteed. You glance at a small ledger where expenses are scratched in uneven handwriting. Flour, salt, candle wax, rent. Each entry represents necessity rather than luxury. Historians still debate the extent to which economic pressures alone drove social unrest during this period versus political ideology or cultural shifts, likely the causes intertwined. Hunger and injustice rarely operate separately. On market day, you notice subtle signs of strain. Buyers hesitate before parting with coins. Vendors defend their prices with firmer tones. The conversation around you carries an undercurrent of calculation. There are moments when taxes increase unexpectedly, often linked to military campaigns. News spreads quickly, faces harden, some respond with resignation, others whisper of fairness and reform. An intriguing detail from court records reveals how smuggling flourished in regions where tariffs made legal trade too costly. Goods crossed borders quietly at night, guided by those willing to risk fines for profit or survival. At home, you stretch resources with care. Soup grows thinner toward the end of the week. Candles burn shorter before being replaced. Repairs are postponed and less urgent, yet obligation also binds community. Shared infrastructure defense and the religious institutions depend on contributions. The balance between collective good and personal strain remains delicate. You walk to the manor house or a municipal office to deliver what is owed. The building stands sturdier than most homes, its walls thick and imposing. Inside an official records your payment with steady pen strokes. Your name enters a ledger among many others. There is relief in settling accounts, even if it leaves your purse lighter. The anxiety of looming debt lifts slightly, replaced by the steady rhythm of planning for the next cycle. Evenings often find you discussing finances in low voices, by the hearth. Calculations repeated, strategies adjusted. Perhaps a child will enter service to ease pressure. Perhaps a small plot of land can be rented out. Scholars continue to analyze how these financial structures shaped everyday psychology. Did constant obligation cultivate prudence and resilience, or did it nurture quiet resentment? Evidence suggests both threads run through personal accounts. As you lie down at night, you feel the invisible weight of these systems pressing gently but persistently against your life. Taxes, tithes, rents. They shape choices about marriage, travel, even diet. Yet you also recognize that within these constraints creativity emerges. Barter agreements, shared labor, informal support networks among neighbors. Outside wind brushes softly against the walls. The village sleeps, each household carrying its own arithmetic of survival. Tomorrow you will rise again, count coins again, weigh grain again. Endurance here includes mastering numbers as surely as mastering tools. And in that steady balancing act between obligation and sustenance, you continue forward, navigating the narrow path between compliance and survival that defines so much of daily life in this demanding century. When coins have been counted and grain carefully measured out to satisfy rent and tithe, you return to the steady hum of making things. Production does not happen only in grand workshops or distant factories. In this century, much of it unfolds quietly within ordinary homes, guided by patient hands and long practice. You sit near the window where light falls strongest and draw a bundle of raw wool into your lap. The fibres feel slightly oily, faintly scented of the sheep from which they came. You begin to tease them apart, preparing them for spinning. This is not like glamorous work. It is repetitive, almost meditative. A widely accepted historical understanding is that before large-scale industrialization transformed Europe, much manufacturing occurred through dispersed cottage industry. Merchants delivered raw materials to rural households, collected finished goods weeks later, and paid modest wages in return. This arrangement, sometimes called the domestic system, linked isolated cottages to broader commercial networks. You set the spinning wheel in motion. The soft, whirring sound fills the room. Your foot presses the treadle rhythmically. Fingers guide fibers into a thin, even thread. Twist, pull, release. The motion settles into muscle memory. Across the table, someone else might be weaving on a small loom. The wooden frame creaks gently as the shuttle passes back and forth. Threads cross precisely, building fabric row by row. You watch the pattern emerge, slowly, each line dependent on the one before it. There is a small but revealing detail found in merchant correspondence, noting complaints about uneven quality in cloth returned from different households. Standards varied. Some families developed reputations for exceptional workmanship, earning slightly better terms. Others struggled to meet expectations. Metalwork offers a different rhythm. In a modest workshop, you might hammer iron into shape over a small forge. Sparks leap briefly into the air before fading. The scent of heated metal mingles with charcoal smoke. Each strike demands precision and strength. Researchers continue to examine how the domestic system altered social structures. On one hand, it provided income opportunities for rural families beyond agriculture. On the other, it increased dependence on merchants who controlled supply and payment. The balance of power rarely favoured the producer. Children participate as well. Small fingers wind spun thread onto spools. Older youths assist in dyeing fabric with natural pigments derived from plants and minerals. Hands stain blue from indigo red from madder root. An unusual anecdote recorded in a provincial archive tells of a village renowned for producing lace so delicate that merchants travelled long distances to secure it. Such specialization could bring modest prosperity, though it also heightened vulnerability to market fluctuations. The hours stretch quietly as you work. Outside, the world continues. A cart rattles past, a dog barks in the distance. Inside, concentration narrows your focus to the thread between your fingers. You think about how these humble tasks connect you to distant consumers you will never meet. A length of cloth woven here may clothe someone in a city hundreds of miles away. A nail forged in your workshop might secure timber in a house far beyond your horizon. Historians still debate the extent to which cottage industry prepared Europe for the sweeping industrial changes that would soon follow. Some argue it laid essential groundwork by organising labour and trade networks. Others suggest the transition disrupted traditional patterns more abruptly than participants could anticipate. Payment for your efforts often arrives late. Coins exchanged after inspection of goods, deductions made for perceived flaws. You accept them with mixed relief and frustration. Yet there is pride in tangible creation. You run your hand over finished fabric and feel its texture smooth beneath your palm. You examine a well-shaped tool and recognize your own skill in its curve. Evenings bring small moments of shared accomplishment. Families compare output, count completed pieces, calculate earnings with cautious optimism. There are risks, too. If demand drops, work vanishes. If a merchant fails to return, wages disappear. Dependency on external markets introduces uncertainty into households already balancing thin margins. You place finished goods carefully in a basket ready for collection. The room feels quieter once the wheel stops turning. The silence carries satisfaction and fatigue in equal measure. Cottage industry shapes daily endurance by blending home and workplace seamlessly. There is no clear boundary between domestic life and economic production. The same table supports both supper and labour. As night deepens, you bank the fire and stretch sore fingers. Tomorrow the wheel will spin again, threads will cross again, metal will ring under hammer blows again. And in this steady making of small, useful things, you sustain not only your own household, but the broader currents of commerce moving silently across Europe. You lie down aware that while kings debate policy and armies march, much of the continent's strength rests in cottages like yours, where quiet industry transforms raw material into livelihood. The embers glow faintly. Outside wind brushes softly along the walls. Inside you rest, knowing that at dawn your hands will resume their patient choreography, weaving endurance into every thread. Even as you spin thread and hammer iron with steady determination, another layer of daily life hums beneath practical effort. Belief in things unseen, not only formal faith expressed in church pews, but the smaller, more intimate convictions that slip quietly into kitchens and fields. You wake one morning to find a small object tucked above the doorway, a sprig of dried herbs tied with string. You recognize it immediately. Protection. Whether against illness, misfortune, or envy, its presence reassures someone in the household. A well-attested historical reality is that folk beliefs and superstitions persisted across 18th century Europe alongside official religious doctrine. Even as scientific inquiry advanced in certain circles, many ordinary people continued to rely on charms, omens, and traditional remedies passed down through generations. You step outside and notice how neighbours interpret subtle signs in weather or animal behaviour. A crow calling repeatedly near the house might be read as a warning, an unexpected rainbow as a blessing. These interpretations do not always replace rational thought. They exist alongside it. There is a curious detail recorded in rural accounts describing how some families placed a horseshoe above the door for good fortune, its curved shape believed to catch and hold luck. You glance at one hanging nearby, metal darkened with age. When illness strikes, remedies extend beyond herbs and vinegar cloths. You might whisper specific words believed to carry healing power. A midwife may tie a ribbon of a particular colour around a labouring woman's wrist, invoking tradition as much as medicine. Researchers continued to explore how these practices coexisted with emerging scientific understanding. The 18th century witnessed remarkable advancements in astronomy, physics, and medicine among educated elites. Yet in villages, knowledge spread slowly, filtered through experience and trust. You remember hearing of cunning folk individuals reputed to possess special insight into ailments or lost property. They are consulted quietly, payment may be modest, their advice blends prayer herbal mixtures and symbolic gestures. There is an anecdote preserved in court proceedings describing disputes over alleged curses placed upon livestock. When cows fell ill unexpectedly, suspicion sometimes fell upon neighbours. Accusations could escalate quickly if not carefully managed. Fear and reassurance intertwine in these beliefs. You may laugh lightly at certain stories, yet still hesitate to ignore them entirely. When a mirror cracks or a candle flickers unexpectedly, a small part of you registers unease. Astrology holds sway in some circles. Almanacs printed with planetary charts circulate in markets offering predictions about favourable days for planting or travel. You might consult one before beginning a major task just in case. Scholars still discuss the extent to which Enlightenment skepticism penetrated rural consciousness during this period. While urban intellectuals debated reason and empiricism, everyday life retained layers of symbolic meaning rooted in older traditions. You sit by the hearth and listen to an elder recount tales of spirits inhabiting forests or rivers. The firelight casts shifting shadows along the walls, making such stories feel almost plausible. Children lean closer, eyes wide. At the same time, you attend church and hear sermons discouraging superstition, urging trust in an established doctrine. Tension arises between official teaching and inherited custom. Even practical tasks carry symbolic undertones. The first loaf baked from new harvest grain might be marked with a small cross before entering the oven. The gesture is brief but intentional. You consider how these beliefs function psychologically. In a world where illness, crop failure, and sudden death remain unpredictable, rituals provide a sense of control. Even if outcomes do not change, the act of doing something feels steadier than helplessness. An unusual practice noted in certain coastal communities involved tossing a coin into the sea before embarking on a voyage, a gesture meant to secure safe passage. Whether sailors truly believed in its efficacy or followed it from habit is difficult to determine. As evening falls, wind rattles shutters gently. You hear it and remember stories of spirits wandering at night. You smile at yourself for the thought, then pull the blanket a little higher regardless. Endurance here includes managing uncertainty not only through labour and calculation but through narrative. You explain the unexplainable in ways that fit within your cultural framework. There is comfort in shared belief. When neighbours nod in agreement about a sign or omen, you feel part of a collective understanding. At the same time, subtle shifts are underway. Printed pamphlets question old assumptions. Scientific demonstrations attract curious crowds in cities. Change moves gradually. You lie down aware that your world holds both reason and ritual, both measured observation and inherited law. The boundary between them is not always sharply drawn. The fire dims softly. Outside, night settles with patient calm. And as you drift towards sleep, you recognize that enduring daily life in this century means carrying layers of meaning within ordinary acts, lighting a candle, hanging herbs, marking bread. Whether these gestures truly alter fate or simply steady the human heart, they weave quiet reassurance into the fabric of existence, helping you face another dawn with cautious confidence. As seasons turn and years accumulate quietly behind you, you begin to notice how firmly society arranges itself into layers. You feel those layers not only in grand palaces rising beyond city walls, but in subtle gestures exchanged in marketplaces and churches. Class is not an abstract theory here. It is visible in fabric, posture, and expectation. You walk through town and pass a carriage rolling smoothly over cobblestones. Its polished surface reflects morning light. Inside sits a family dressed in fine cloth, their movements unhurried. A widely recognized structural feature of 18th century Europe is the persistence of a hierarchical social order composed broadly of nobility, clergy, and commoners, though details vary across kingdoms. Birth often shapes destiny more strongly than ambition. You glance down at your own worn shoes and feel the quiet awareness of your place. Yet class boundaries, while firm, are not entirely immovable. In growing urban centres, commerce opens narrow doors of opportunity. A successful merchant might accumulate wealth rivaling that of minor aristocrats, even if social recognition lags behind. Researchers continue to explore how frequently individuals truly ascended the social ladder during this period. Some evidence suggests limited but meaningful mobility in cities where trade flourished. In rural regions, upward movement remains more constrained, tied closely to land ownership and inheritance. You think of apprentices who become masters, of servants who marry into stable households, of soldiers who return with modest pensions and new connections. Each story carries its own degree of possibility and limitation. There is an intriguing anecdote preserved in correspondence from a provincial town describing a baker's son who earned a scholarship to study law in a distant city. His education shifted not only his own prospects, but the standing of his entire family. Such cases remain rare, yet they illuminate cracks in rigid structures. Clothing continues to signal hierarchy. Silk and lace whisper of privilege, coarse wool announces labour, even posture can reveal upbringing. Those accustomed to authority carry themselves differently from those accustomed to obedience. In church, seating arrangements reflect rank. Wealthier families occupy pews nearer the altar. The poor stand or sit farther back, though all pray under the same roof. Distinctions remain clear. Economic shifts complicate the picture. Expanding trade networks create new fortunes among merchants and financiers. Enlightenment ideas circulate, questioning inherited privilege. You overhear quiet discussions in taverns about fairness and about merit versus birthright. Scholars still debate whether the 18th century witnessed genuine ideological erosion of aristocratic dominance before revolutionary upheavals transformed parts of Europe. Seeds of change are visible, though their full consequences remain unseen from your vantage point. You notice how marriage can alter status subtly. A well-matched union may elevate a family's standing. Conversely, financial misfortune can erode it quickly. Respectability proves fragile. There are also invisible hierarchies within the common classes themselves. Skilled artisans often command greater respect than unskilled labourers. Landholding peasants stand apart from landless workers. The social map contains many gradations. You feel pride in your craft, whatever it may be. Skill offers dignity even when wealth does not. Reputation becomes currency within your circle. Yet you cannot ignore barriers. Certain professions remain closed to those without proper lineage or patronage. Legal privileges shield nobles from some taxes borne by others. Resentment simmers quietly in some quarters. There is a small but telling detail noted in estate records, describing how noble families sometimes adopted fashions or tastes originating among the rising bourgeoisie, particularly in matters of commerce or intellectual pursuits. Influence flows both upward and downward in unexpected ways. As evening falls, you sit by the hearth and reflect on your own position within this layered world. You may not command great estates or titles, but you command your household. You contribute to your community. You endure. Mobility may be limited, yet dignity remains within reach through effort and reputation. Children may aspire to slightly broader horizons than their parents knew. Literacy, trade, and travel widen perspective gradually. You consider how class shapes not only material conditions, but self-perception. You learn to measure yourself against neighbours rather than distant aristocrats. Contentment becomes relative. Outside, the village settles into quiet. Stars shimmer above rooftops indifferent to rank. In darkness, distinctions blur slightly. All houses glow faintly with hearthlight. You lie down aware that tomorrow will bring the same layered interactions. Respect shown upward, authority exercised downward, cooperation among equals. Endurance in this century include navigating these hierarchies with care, knowing when to bow and when to stand firm, recognizing opportunity without overreaching. And as sleep approaches, you sense that while structures feel solid now, subtle shifts are already underway. Ideas circulate, wealth moves, generations change. For the moment, you rest within the place allotted to you, carrying both acceptance and quiet ambition beneath the same blanket, waiting to see how the next turning of history might reshape the layers that define your world. Just when you begin to feel that you understand the steady layers of society and the familiar turning of seasons, nature reminds you that stability is always provisional. The sky darkens at the wrong time of year. The air shifts strangely. You look across your fields and sense unease before you can name it. A late frost descends in spring silvering tender shoots that only days ago seemed full of promise. You step outside at dawn and hear the faint crunch beneath your boots. The leaves hang limp and darkened. A widely documented environmental reality of the 18th century is that Europe still felt the lingering effects of what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler and more erratic climate patterns that could devastate crops with little warning. You kneel and touch a withered stem. It bends too easily. Around you, neighbours move silently through their plots, expressions tight. No proclamation is needed. Everyone understands what this might mean. If summer brings drought instead, the ground cracks beneath relentless sun. Streams shrink. Livestock grow thin. You watch clouds gather in the distance only to disperse again without delivering rain. Hope becomes a daily exercise. There is a striking detail preserved in parish records from certain regions describing special prayer services held during times of prolonged drought or excessive rain. Communities gathered to petition for mercy from the elements. Faith and agriculture intertwine deeply. Researchers continue to examine how resilient rural economies were to climatic shocks. Some areas maintained grain reserves or diversified crops to mitigate risk. Others remained perilously dependent on a single successful harvest. When storms arrive suddenly, they do so with theatrical force. Thunder splits the sky, wind lashes roofs and bends trees, hail pounds fields with merciless rhythm. You stand at your doorway watching the violence unfold, powerless to intervene. Flooding can follow heavy rains. Rivers swell beyond their banks, carrying debris and silt into low-lying homes. You scramble to move valuables higher, lifting chests and bedding away from creeping water. In cities, food shortages triggered by rural crop failures ripple outward quickly. Bread prices rise, markets thin, tension grows palpable. There are historical accounts of unrest erupting when scarcity collides with perceived injustice in distribution. A curious anecdote from rural folklore recounts villagers firing small cannons or ringing church bells during approaching storms, believing the noise might disperse threatening clouds. Whether these actions offered comfort more than practical effect is open to interpretation. You consider how intimately your survival depends on forces beyond human control. No amount of careful spinning or counting coins can replace a failed harvest. Autumn arrives and you assess what remains. Grain stores appear thinner than usual. You calculate rations carefully. Soup grows more watery. What becomes rare. Historians still debate how frequently local shortages escalated into full-scale famine during this century, noting significant regional variation. Improved transportation networks gradually reduced the likelihood of widespread catastrophe in some areas, yet isolated communities remained vulnerable. You witness quiet acts of solidarity. Neighbours share seed for next planting. Families combine meals. Those slightly better off extend small loans or gifts to those in greater need. At the same time, fear can erode generosity. When supplies shrink, suspicion grows. Accusations of hoarding surface. Trust is tested. Children sense the change in mood even if they do not grasp its cause fully. They notice smaller portions and hushed conversations after dark. Winter following a poor harvest feels longer than usual. The wind seems sharper, the nights more silent. You lie awake listening to it press against the walls, yet even within hardship adaptation emerges. Some turn to alternative crops more resilient to cold, others seek temporary work in towns to supplement income. Mobility increases when necessity demands it. A documented historical trend reveals that communities gradually adopted new agricultural practices over the century, experimenting with crop rotation and new plant varieties such as the potato in certain regions. These innovations offered greater food security over time, though acceptance was uneven. You reflect on how endurance here is not static but adaptive. Each climatic blow teaches lessons. Store more when possible. Diversify where you can. Strengthen communal ties. As spring approaches again, you walk back into your field with cautious optimism. The soil smells rich despite past disappointment. You press seeds into earth once more, trusting that not every year will betray your effort. The sky above remains unpredictable, yet it also offers beauty. Sunlight breaking through clouds, rainbows arcing briefly after storms, golden light settling across yielding grain. You stand at the edge of your land and feel both vulnerability and resilience woven tightly together. Nature may challenge you relentlessly, but it also sustains you when conditions align. Night falls gently after a day of labour. You return indoors and warm your hands by the hearth. In this century, enduring daily life means accepting that control is partial at best. You prepare diligently, adapt creatively, and lean on community when weather turns cruel. The wind quiets outside, the fire glows steady within, and you rest knowing that while storms will come again, so too will seeds rain, and the stubborn human's impulse to plant anew despite uncertainty, carrying hope forward through each unpredictable season. As years gather quietly behind you like stacked firewood, you begin to notice the subtle shift in your own body. Movements once effortless now require a pause. Knees stiffen when you rise from a low stool. Fingers that once spun thread swiftly now work a little more slowly. Aging in 18th century Europe is neither hidden nor sentimentalized. It unfolds in plain view of family and neighbours. You sit near the hearth, feeling its warmth seep into joints that protest cold more loudly than before. A demographic truth supported by parish records is that while average life expectancy at birth was relatively low due to high infant mortality, many individuals who survived childhood lived into their 60s or beyond. Old age was not unheard of, though it was earned through endurance. Your hair thins or turns silver, lines deepen around your eyes. These marks are not cosmetic inconveniences. They are evidence of seasons survived, harvests gathered, illnesses endured, children raised. In households where generations share space, elders often remain integrated into daily life rather than separated from it. You may no longer lift heavy sacks of grain, but you shell peas, mend nets, watch young children while others labour in fields. Knowledge becomes your currency. There is a gentle yet telling detail preserved in family letters describing how grandparents recounted stories of earlier hardships, passing practical wisdom about weather patterns, crop rotation, or household management. Memory itself becomes a tool. Researchers continue to examine how aging was experienced differently across social classes. Wealth could soften physical decline through better diet and less demanding labour. Poverty often accelerated wear on the body. Yet even modest households valued elders for experience and continuity. You feel pride when a younger neighbour seeks your advice on planting or negotiating market prices. Your voice carries weight earned through time rather than title. At the same time, vulnerability increases. Illness strikes harder. Recovery takes longer. You become more aware of mortality not as abstract concept but as approaching reality. There is an unusual anecdote from a provincial diary recounting how an elderly woman kept a small box of keepsakes beneath her bed of tokens collected across decades. Ribbons from a wedding day, a coin from a prosperous year. Such objects anchor memory. In some regions, charitable institutions or parish support assist those unable to work. Yet reliance on charity can feel heavy. Pride mingles with gratitude. Scholars still discuss how communities balanced respect for elders with practical necessity. When resources grew scarce, supporting those no longer fully productive could strain households. Yet abandonment was not the norm. Family obligation remained strong. You walk slowly through the village and notice how children greet you with familiarity. They have always known you as the steady presence near the hearth. Your pace may have slowed, but your place remains. Physical endurance changes shape. Where once you endured through muscle and speed, now you endure through patience and reflection. You measure days less by tasks completed and more by moments observed. Evenings become particularly meaningful. You sit watching flames dance and think of winters long past, of markets bustling decades ago, of wars that once seemed all-consuming but now rest in memory. A commonly acknowledged social pattern of the era is that inheritance planning occupied significant attention among aging household heads. Land tools and modest savings required careful allocation to prevent conflict. You discuss these matters quietly with family, hoping to leave clarity rather than dispute. There is also spiritual preparation. Confession prayer, reflection on life lived. You find comfort in familiar rituals that have accompanied you for years. You notice how younger adults shoulder heavier burdens now, they rise earlier. They carry more weight. You watch with a mixture of relief and wistfulness. Despite bodily decline, joy persists. The laughter of grandchildren, the taste of fresh bread, the warmth of sun on your face during a mild afternoon. Historians continue to explore whether old age was perceived primarily as burden or blessing in this period. Evidence suggests a nuanced reality. Respect coexisted with hardship. As night deepens, you lie down carefully, adjusting blankets to ease stiff joints. Breathing feels slower but steady. You understand that enduring daily life in this century has carried you through childhood labour, marriage, illness, scarcity and celebration. Aging becomes another chapter in that long narrative. Outside wind moves gently through trees. Inside the hearth glows softly. And as you drift towards sleep, you recognise that the resilience you once applied to ploughing fields now applies to accepting change within yourself. Time reshapes you just as surely as weather reshapes land. Yet you remain here breathing quietly beneath timber beams, a living bridge between past and present, holding memory like a lantern that lights the path for those who will continue long after you have laid down your tools. As you sit with the weight of years settling gently around your shoulders, you begin to sense that the world beyond your village lanes and city squares is shifting in ways both subtle and profound. Ideas travel now with increasing speed, carried not only by travellers and merchants, but by printed pages that question long-held assumptions. You hear unfamiliar words spoken in taverns and coffee houses. Reason, liberty, natural rights. They sound almost abstract at first, like concepts belonging to scholars rather than farmers or artisans, yet they seep slowly into conversation. A well-established historical development of the 18th century is the rise of intellectual movements often grouped under the term Enlightenment. Thinkers across Europe challenged traditional authority, advocating for rational inquiry, scientific observation, and sometimes political reform. While such debates flourished most visibly among educated elites, their echoes reached wide audiences over time. You might not read dense philosophical treatises yourself, but you overhear summaries delivered passionately by someone who has. The air in the tavern feels charged as voices rise and fall in argument. Some listeners nod eagerly, others shake their heads wary of change. There is a compelling detail preserved in correspondence from provincial towns describing how local reading societies formed pooling funds to purchase books and newspapers collectively. Members gathered to discuss ideas once confined to distant academies. Curiosity becomes communal. Researchers continue to examine how deeply these intellectual currents penetrated rural communities. Did abstract notions of equality truly reshape the thinking of peasants bound by tradition, or did they remain largely urban phenomena until political upheaval forced broader engagement? Evidence suggests uneven diffusion shaped by literacy, mobility, and economic circumstance. Scientific demonstrations attract crowds in certain cities. Public lectures on electricity or astronomy captivate audiences. You imagine standing in a hall where sparks leap from a device designed to harness static charge, eliciting gasps from onlookers. Wonder blends with skepticism. At the same time, monarchs attempt reforms, inspired by rational governance. Administrative efficiency improves in some regions, legal codes are revised, yet change often moves cautiously constrained by entrenched interests. There is an unusual anecdote recorded in a traveller's journal describing a farmer who proudly experimented with new crop rotation techniques after reading about them in a pamphlet. Innovation filters downward in practical ways as well as philosophical ones. You feel tension between tradition and novelty. Faith remains central, hierarchy persists, yet whispers of different possibilities circulate persistently. In certain parts of Europe, revolutionary fervour begins to stir more visibly. News of uprisings elsewhere sparks both hope and fear. You sense that established structures might not remain untouched forever. Scholars still debate the extent to which economic hardship versus ideological conviction drove political revolutions during this era. Likely both currents converged, amplifying one another. You sit by the hearth and reflect on your own life shaped by obligations, seasons, and community ties. The idea that birth alone should determine destiny feels both familiar and quietly contested. Children growing up now may inherit a slightly altered world. Schools expand gradually. Printed materials become more affordable. Curiosity is encouraged in some quarters, discouraged in others. You watch a young person trace letters by candlelight and wonder what ideas will fill their mind that never crossed yours at that age. The pace of change remains uneven. In many villages, daily routine continues much as it has for generations. Fields still demand labour. Markets still trade in grain and cloth. Yet beneath these continuities, intellectual undercurrents flow steadily. You feel both cautious and intrigued. Stability has carried you this far. Upheaval threatens uncertainty. Yet stagnation carries its own quiet frustrations. As evening deepens, you listen to distant conversation drifting through open windows. Words about reform rights and governance mingle with talk of weather and livestock. In this century, endurance now includes adapting not only to physical hardship but to shifting mental landscapes. Old certainties are questioned. New possibilities emerge. You lie down aware that while your own days may continue much as before, the world your grandchildren inherit may look different in ways difficult to fully imagine. The fire dims softly. Outside, the night stretches calm and vast. And as you drift towards sleep, you sense that history is not only something that happens in distant capitals, it unfolds quietly in taverns, in reading circles, in whispered conversations by candlelight. You have endured cold winters and failed harvests. Now you endure the slow transformation of ideas, watching as thought itself becomes a force shaping the path ahead. Tomorrow you will rise and resume familiar tasks. Yet somewhere beyond your fields and streets, currents of change gather strength. And whether you embrace them eagerly or cautiously, you remain part of this unfolding story, living at the hinge between inherited tradition and emerging possibility. Night settles gently over your village or city, softer now than in earlier years of your life. The air carries the faint scent of wood smoke and distant earth. You sit for a moment longer by the hearth, watching embers pulse with quiet light. All that you have endured seems to gather here in this glow. Cold mornings, hard bread, laughter at markets, illness at midnight. Storms that flattened crops, bells that marked both weddings and funerals. You stretch your hands toward the fading warmth and feel the ache in your knuckles, the memory of decades of work embedded in bone and skin. Endurance in 18th century Europe has never been dramatic in the way epic tales describe heroism. It has been steady, repetitive, unadorned. A broadly supported historical truth is that most people in this century lived lives defined less by extraordinary events and more by ordinary persistence. They rose at dawn because animals required feeding. They planted seed because winter would otherwise be merciless. They married, bore children, buried loved ones, and began again. You glance around your small room, timber beams darkened by smoke, a table scarred by years of use, a chest containing modest possessions. Nothing here is extravagant, yet everything holds memory. There is a quiet, almost surprising detail preserved in estate inventories, showing how even the poorest households often possessed a few cherished items. Perhaps a painted plate, a well-worn book, a ribbon carefully folded away. Such objects remind you that even within constraint, beauty found a foothold. Historians still discuss whether people of this era viewed their lives primarily through the lens of hardship or through acceptance shaped by expectation. From where you sit now, it seems likely that both truths coexist. Suffering was real, so was resilience. Outside, the sky stretches dark and immense. Without electric glow to dull its brilliance, stars shimmer clearly overhead. You step briefly to the doorway and look up. The same constellations that guided sailors and farmers alike watch silently. Your breath rises faintly in cool air. Somewhere in the distance a dog barks once, then falls silent. The village rests. You think back across the years. The first time you held a newborn child, the day you signed your name shakily on a contract. The market mornings thick with noise. The winter nights when wind pressed fiercely against walls, yet you remained warm enough by shared firelight. There were moments of fear, of hunger that gnawed sharply, of taxes that strained patience, of war that pulled loved ones away. Yet there were also moments of music of harvest feasts, of stories told until laughter chased shadows from corners. Researchers continue to reflect on how communities cultivated endurance not through grand speeches, but through ritual and repetition. Lighting fires, sharing meals, marking seasons. These patterns steadied minds as much as bodies. You return inside and lower yourself carefully onto bedding. The straw rustles softly beneath you. The blanket feels familiar, textured by countless nights. In the quiet, you sense that daily life in this century has always been about balance, between scarcity and celebration, between obedience and quiet ambition, between tradition and emerging change. Your eyelids grow heavy. Now, as promised, let the world soften around you. The hearthlight dims further until only a faint glow remains. Shadows blur gently along the walls. Outside wind moves through trees with a slow, steady rhythm, almost like breathing. You do not need to hold every detail of this century in your mind. Let it drift. Let the sound of distant bells fade into the background. Let the image of fields under moonlight settle quietly. You have walked through cold dawns and crowded markets. You have felt the weight of wool and the warmth of shared bread. You have listened to stories by firelight and to storms against fragile roofs. And now there is nothing more required of you tonight. The fields can wait until morning. The market will bustle again in its time. The seasons will continue their turning whether you watch them or not. For now you rest. Imagine the steady crackle of embers easing into silence. Imagine the night sky stretching wide and patient above rooftops and open land alike. Imagine the gentle rise and fall of breathing in the room around you. You have endured this long journey through daily life in 18th century Europe, and in doing so you have witnessed quiet courage woven into every ordinary hour. Let that knowledge feel calm rather than heavy. The stars remain, the air cools softly, the world grows still. Close your eyes, sleep comes slowly, gently, without demand. And as it carries you away, remember that resilience often lives not in loud triumph, but in the simple act of rising each morning and meeting the day. Sweet dreams.